It's just come up there saying it's now streaming on YouTube.
52 waiting, it says.
Okay, great. All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome. Welcome. We have a great day planned today and tomorrow for you. Yes, actually, we are on YouTube, my friend. We are recording to the cloud and we are on YouTube. We are LinkedIn. We are tweeting. We are online. We are very online. Welcome to everyone. I'm Daniel Tutt. I'm happy to host this symposium on Slavoj Zizek. This has been a great summer activity to reach out to Žižekian scholars around the world, people that have written on Slavoj's work, people that he has engaged with over the years. We have a number of very senior scholars of Žižek's work. Tomorrow, Slavoj will himself be with us as well. This is a symposium designed to probe into Žižek's thought, to examine some of the dimensions of Žižek's thinking that from all different angles, from the angle of gender, from the angle of politics, from Marxism, psychoanalytic theory, a whole range, given that Žižek is perhaps known as a philosopher of everything, it is quite pertinent that we have people coming at his thinking from many different angles. I want to turn it over to the person who thought of the idea of this conference, Duane Roussel, and invite him to turn his camera on so he can say hello and say maybe just a few brief things about why we are gathered today. Duane, are you able to turn your camera on?
And say that the stream hasn't started on YouTube. The stream hasn't started. People are complaining.
Yes, there's a new stream. I'm going to put a link for it. It is right here. Okay, hold on one sec. I wasn't able to connect it to the... So let me put it in the chat right now. But Duane, please jump on.
Yeah, okay. What are we going to do though? Because I don't see our first presenter here. Will Mark present first?
Mark, can you go first?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, but yeah, give me 1 second to go and get Wanyoung, and then but I'm happy to...
You got 5 minutes, okay?
All right.
I can also go first if it's easier.
No, it's fine. She did next. It's fine. We can go. It's fine. If it's it's
okay, folks. Good.
Daniel, people on Facebook, on YouTube rather, won't get this link.
Yeah, you'll see it in the chat there. You see it in the chat. People can find it there. Yeah.
I can't see in the chat.
The YouTube chat, I think.
No, not
yeah, it's there. We have about 20 people watching, so people are aware of it. It's okay. Okay, great. Duane, take it away, my friend.
Wonderful. Thanks, Daniel. So I guess the question is, why are we here? Which I don't know. But I think what I can do is kind of answer in a roundabout way. Basically, we're here because I wanted the opportunity to drink coffee or something like that with each one of you for various reasons. You likely already know about this wonderful thought that was shared with Slavoj, I think, from Alenka Supancic, who just arrived. Hi, Alenka. It's about a famous scene from Ernst Lubitsch's classic film, Ninatchka. And in it, there's a man, you know, he's trying to impress a woman at a cafe. And so he tells her a joke. She seems unimpressed, if I remember correctly. And the joke goes something like this. This is what Alenka shared with us many years ago. A man enters a cafe and asks the waiter for a cup of coffee without cream. The waiter replies, "Sir, we only have milk. So may I please bring you coffee without milk instead?" Okay, so what's the basic lesson? Basically, that which is not included in the object is somehow intimately bound up with the identity of that object, or something like that. But what fascinates me when I hear this is that, and maybe I'm a bit naive, I admit it, is that cream and milk are basically reducible to the same thing. They're both milk. So maybe it's a little silly, but when I think of this example, I think milk is the psychoanalytic object in some sense par excellence, because it denotes the excesses of the maternal position. So why in both scenarios, whether coffee without cream or coffee without milk, should milk be effaced by this signifier, coffee? For Lacan, this effacement inaugurates the subject split by the signifier. In both instances, we're dealing with a signifier effacing the mother's desire, which means that it's actually a bit of a false choice between not cream or not coffee. In both cases, you're not having milk. So you're on the side of the efficiency of the signifier. I like to imagine something like an alternative scene set in maybe contemporary California or Los Angeles or wherever, where it's now quite fashionable, you know, for there to be breast milk cafes where you can get breast milk ice cream and so on. In this alternative scene, a man, I will get to my point and then I'll shut up. A man enters the cafe, requests to have the object precisely for what it is, not for what's missing in the object. In other words, the milk must be included. In fact, if you enter a breast milk cafe and you order coffee without milk, you'll probably insult the shopkeeper. We'll say something like, "Sir, we only serve breast milk here. So if you want a shop from which you can order coffee without cream, you'll have to leave immediately," or whatever. At which point, maybe the man will leave, cross the street, go to another cafe, order his coffee without cream, get his coffee without milk, and then complain to the baristas at the coffee shop about those crazy fuckers across the street or whatever. So maybe I'll just approach this in another way, and then I'll stop. I don't think today we are encountering, you know, what happened in that famous Seinfeld episode where George Costanza was asked by a woman late into the evening to come up to her apartment for coffee. You know, the idea is George was a bit of an idiot. He said, "No, thank you, I don't drink coffee this late." Of course, it meant sex. Maybe she would have responded, "It's okay, I don't have any coffee anyway." But my claim is that that simply doesn't happen anymore. Like, more often we're asked directly, "Do you want to come up to my apartment for sex?" And like, it probably says much more about me than it does anybody else, but I would say, no, I just want to drink some coffee and have a conversation. So I think this is the milk without coffee world that we're now living in. And it gives us reasons to sit in different places, maybe in different coffee shops and so on. So basically we're here today because I feel like I'm in this lonely position of engaging with the work of the Slovenian school for all of these years, and yet I do it in my own way. And so I nonetheless prefer to sit at the same table with all of you, even if you're not interested in having exactly what it is that I'm having. So our event for the next 2 days is made up of people whose work has engaged with the Slovenian school, and more particularly the work of Slavoj Zizek and Alenka Supančič. Yet each one of you, each of the people that are presenting in the next 2 days, have done it in your own way, your own sort of singular way. So I would welcome each one of you here, including those who are watching live on YouTube or whatever. And thank you each for participating in this chaotic and strange event. I want to thank especially Alenka and Slavoj for dedicating time to this. We're here because we're all friends with you and your work. Slavoj once said to me that he's 33 years older than me, which makes him one Jesus. That's what he said. I wouldn't disagree with him. But I think over the next 2 days at this table that we're sitting at, we're going to find out that there are still among us some Judas figures. So let's start.
Thank you so much, Duane. Welcome everyone again. We are going to get started with our first paper, a slight reorganization of the speakers. We were going to begin with Graham Harman, but he does not appear to be with us right now. So instead, Mark and Wanyoung have agreed to be our first presenters. Is that right? Are you all prepared to go?
We are. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. Let
Can you
me
hear us?
introduce you very briefly to the audience before you begin. Mark Gerard Murphy is studies theology as well as Lacanian psychoanalysis, has been involved with our channel, our YouTube channel, and our study group efforts since the pandemic time for the past 2-3 years in a very rigorous way. Studied Lacan Seminar 17 over the course of a few months, where we met every single week, every Thursday night, as we do, and rigorously read line by line that particular, Seminar 18, the one after the other side of psychoanalysis, on the Semblant. And Mark has been somebody who's extremely dedicated to the Lacanian field, and Wanyoung is a translator of a number of works from French into English, is a philosopher and a writer, has actually translated Alain Badiou's work on Nietzsche, the seminars that he gave on Nietzsche in the 90s, which you can find on her academia page. And her dissertation has also been published, which I highly recommend that you check out. I'll put a link to that in the chat. The title of this dual paper that they will be giving together is called Anti-Antigone, From a Politics of Desire to a Politics of Love, Rethinking the Politics of the One All Alone. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. I'm going to take, as I've shared the script for people on there, and I'm happy to share it through whatever medium as well. Okay, the idea is we're going to stick to the script because it's a dual paper, and then that will, if people want to be able to read afterwards, they can as well. So, so this talk critiques what we can call a political theory of desire. For a long time, the basis for political analysis has operated on what we can call constitutive lack, the symbolic, the paternal signifier, and object petit a. This conceptual apparatus is, we argue, defunct in an age of paternal disintegration. The figure of desire in the Lacanian corpus, we'll argue, is Antigone. She refuses to give up desire. She refuses to give up her desire. We thus suggest that a figure is needed who goes beyond constitutive lack from the Lacanian concept of the one all alone towards reimagining the social bond as a process of knotting. So I'm going to take it away from here. But in the early work of Todd McGowan, he argues that we have moved from a political paradigm of duty to one of satisfaction, exemplified by the neoliberal commandment to enjoy. He posits that the way we can move forward from this superegoic commandment is to shift forward to a politics of desire. If in the past, for instance, society operated by the symbolic coordinates of duty, now there has been a transition to a more tyrannical injunction, that of a superegoic enjoyment. He's talking about the rise of Thatcherism, Reaganism, and the transformation of duty to a duty to consume. Moreover, he shows that eventually morphed into the post-Soviet attenuated optimism that came with Fukuyama's End of History. In short, if in the past the problem was a desire in the face of the prohibition of the father who demands that we relinquish the pleasure principle, now we have the rise of an injunction that tells us that there is nothing outside of the pleasure principle, and this inevitably comes with its own psychological trauma. In response to the paralytic superegoic commandment that one must enjoy through the image, McGowan argues that we need to embrace what he calls partial enjoyment. He argues that prohibition needs to be re-established to protect us from a culture of commodified enjoyment lest civilization descends into chaos. He then argues that this partial enjoyment is defined by uncertainty, and that one of its defining features is that we do not know if we actually have it. He then says that this partial enjoyment is politically valuable because it allows a connection to others. Hence, there is an ethical imperative when preserving our embrace of impartial enjoyment, as it also applies to that of the other. In short, he argues that in the face of such imaginary unitary satisfactions that permeate our life world, there is an ethical imperative to preserve desire. However, this argument seems to me to be problematic. Partial enjoyment is another way of arguing that we must re-establish a politics of desire in the face of neoliberal phallic enjoyment. And is this not precisely what we see today when many speak about a return to tradition, a return of prohibition to create the coordinates of out of a saturated culture of endless enjoyment? We can see it in the new work of theologian Jacob Phillips, whose new book, Obedience as Freedom, argues precisely this. Although writing from a traditional theological perspective, the book argues that the only way to find our way through this egoic injunction of enjoyment is through personal moral development. By giving up the freedom that is not a freedom, we need to rethink and reestablish a virtue ethic of obedience to find a more three-dimensional understanding of what it means to be free. And although I can agree with the book's premise, we disagree with its solution. There can be no return to a politics of prohibition, no matter how subtle, precisely because of the condition under which the paternal signifier is instantiated has ultimately evaporated. Similar issue can be seen in Daniel's work. He argues that this is due to the initiation problem stemming from the nuclear family's dissolution. He draws on the arguments beautifully of Christopher Lasch, but filters them through a Lacanian and Badiouian politics. His conclusion, therefore, is structural, as a structural argument as opposed to a moral one, like Jacob's, about the inventive value of the commune as a way of countering the aforementioned problem. However, again, the idea that we can find our way outside tyrannical enjoyment and punitive neoliberalism is precisely the problem. Arguments that hinge on the fantasy of preserving the social bond via a logic of constitutive lack are defunct via valorizing the Oedipus complex or any paternalism. They are, to my mind, representative of what I believe the biggest metaphor is Antigone in Seminar 7. The decision of Antigone is a desire that takes it beyond the symbolic order and thus represents its destruction. Indeed, at the end of the play, everyone dies. Furthermore, Antigone chastises Creon's happiness before her immurement by telling her that she is of the tribe that asks questions and hates man's hopes. Lacan's writing up to then was focused primarily on the ethics of desire as being apophatically emptied of any reference to happiness for a long while. For Lacan, at this specific stage, the ethics of analysis is an ethics of desire, qua desire, and Antigone, therefore, represents a subject at the end of analysis. They have refused to give up on their desire at the expense of the symbolic order. However, such a treatment presupposes an outlook of an analytic outlook that could be called neurotocentric. The assumption of the general functionality of the symbolic as sustained by the paternal metaphor needs to be considered. What happens to this form of singularity if there is no framework to sustain desire from the outset? What if the paternal function is not just lost, but completely foreclosed? What if Creon doesn't exist and there is no point of resistance that we can latch onto? It is known that in psychoanalytic theory, we can speak of the condition of extraordinary psychosis and what we can call ordinary psychosis. The latter is a type of foreclosure that still functions as if it is neurotic through a process of self-naming. And this is what Lacan's work on Seminar 23 is about. Joyce cured himself of psychoses through self-naming, but ultimately ended up in a predicament of becoming isolated in his cure through writing. We believe our problem today is that of our previous world's very coordinates of desire are lost. And there is no return to a politics of desire, precisely because neoliberalism has shifted that much. With the advent of COVID and the conflation of catastrophe, crises upon catastrophe, we are now in the era of a generalized foreclosure and what Lacan called the one all alone via the prevalence of the Latus. We live in an era where self-naming is a necessary part of what it means to live as ones all alone. We endlessly write to each other instead of speaking, but at the same time, even as we are more connected, we are more disconnected, separated by our own antagonistic jouissance. To be sure, the capitalist discourse has commodified the need to self-name, and we are forced to write and write without end as part of the attention economy where we become objects to be consumed by the other. As the psychoanalyst Wolfing states, subjects reduced to numbers have become speaking bodies who rely on numbers to measure themselves. Diets, exercise, substance abuse, as well as social media, phone apps that replace speech with writing, all reduce human activities to numbers. There is no point, this is the point, there is no escaping isolation now, or rather there is no escaping the era of jouissance as such as isolating certainty. Moreover, because of the failure of symbolic efficiency, the horror we deal with is not one of postmodern flux and a neurotic injunction to enjoy as mapped out above, but the overbearing static reality of a saturated meaning that bears down on us from all angles through the prevalence of their Lathus. And the psychoanalyst Marie-Hélène Bruch reflects in this in her latest work on feminine jouissance, which is an excellent read, which I'd fully recommend. The problem is also reflected directly with the philosopher Byung-Chul Han in his work on capitalism and the death drive. Concerning the latter, Byung-Chul Han's intervention on the digital panopticon is relevant. From his perspective, the current digital apocalypse is about a relentless desire to be seen. It is about a pitiless, manufactured digital gaze destroying people's stories in the name of transparency and proximity as data replaces narrative. Incidentally, Jordan Peele's new film, Nope, resonates with this idea, this theme of spectacle and transformation of personal trauma from narrative into just data and spectacle. And it's an excellent film. I just see it. It's really arresting. Go and see it. There is thus a choice, we argue, between the aloneness of the capitalist discourse or the singularity of the analytic discourse and the encounter with the real. There is the isolation of the capitalist discourse or the solitude of the one all alone in the analytic act, which allows the invention of the social bond via love or transference, rather than the law of the Lathus. To summarize, in a neurotocentric world, a term invented by psychoanalyst Alistair Duncan, the overriding problem concerns dealing with the permutations of lack, which takes the form of unceasing doubt, uncertainty, and not knowing what one's desires. The problem, however, today is one concerning the damage of certainty. One of the consequences of our digital age is that our suffering does not come in the form of lack, but as a lack of a lack, and the opaqueness of being alone, completely alone, even as we try to write our way out of isolation. And we see how our aloneness is made all the more concrete as we fail to account for the other in our self-naming and the bubbles and fraternities and echo chambers this certainty creates. The philosopher and psychoanalyst Isabel Miller argues that what holds the social bond together today is what Lacan calls, and I've said this previously, the latus, which means gadgets. Moreover, these gadgets proceed from a logic which fundamentally differs from and unsettles the normal libidinal economy of sexed human beings qua beings of language. In short, these gadgets close the necessary gap needed for desire to work and lead us to the capitalist discourse of singularity. We are trapped as commodified Antigones, trying to engage in a fraudulent analytic act in the digitized cave of the latus. Remember, at the end of Creon's play, Antigone is seen as beautiful because she engages in the act. And can we not see then in our own paradigm of monstration, each person trying to show that they are engaging in an act in their bubbles? Each person is trying to recover the coordinates of their desire after repeated trauma. And we cannot see this today in much of our trauma discourse. In the work of Alenka Supancic, we can see today a kind of replacement of political discourse with this prevalence of therapy speak that helps us engage in a refusal of suffering. We see it everywhere, from apps that can offer quick fix mental health cures to online tests. We take to measure and quantify the kind of suffering that has battered us in our day-to-day life. And Žižek states this in his new book. He states, we are saturated with right-wing conspiracy theories about COVID-19 and how they get combined with New Age spirituality. Melissa Ryan Lively's focus on wellness, natural health, organic food, yoga, Ayurvedic healing, meditation, etc., led her to violently reject vaccines as a source of dangerous contamination. And on that point, I'm going to hand you on over to my wonderful partner, Dr. Wanyoung Kim, who's going to read the rest in better tones than I can. I'll go through that. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Tupanamba makes the astute point that the language of trauma distracts us from the trauma itself. This means that when we are faced with the loss of a world, the loss of a loved one or political trauma, and are made to be completely alone, then the very therapeutic strategies we engage in becomes about not looking at the whole we have lost, otherwise we will lose our minds. Hence, we take it daily, engaging in various spirituality techniques, distracting ourselves with work and breathing exercises. And what we result in is just a way of coping with our lost world. Tupanamba very aptly calls this the act of mourning without a lost object. In other words, we cope with our isolation by pouring all our energy into ignoring precisely what is lost. However, the problem with such Latusian therapeutic techniques is that they preclude any invention of a social link. Indeed, in tending to existential wounds, we lock ourselves perpetually in the attention economy, in a logic of addiction, a logic of Oedipal recovery, endlessly writing without speech. However, we think Tupanamba is wrong in arguing that we need to free ourselves of hope to move forward, a courage of hopelessness to fight for the world we have already lost in the future. We still think that this falls into a castrative logic that, again, falls into the category of giving up the pleasure principle. So we think what is needed is a separation of therapeutic optimism from hope, a foreclosure of optimism, if you will. We need to separate therapeutic optimism from hope to recover the latter. A dark hope, opaque, interruptive, anxious, consciously impractical, a hope without optimism, a hope that is not afraid of suffering and looking directly at broken bodies and what we have lost. We believe that such a hope, a radical hope, begins with love. So how do we move from our isolation towards creating a new social link? As mentioned, we argue that the latter Antigone is a mourning figure, while in the 14th century mystic, Julian of Norwich, there is a figure of radical hope and love. Antigone represents a figure who wants to change the world in defiance of the world, a defiance of the law as a figure of the radical act, while Julian is a figure who has already lost the world, accepts that loss for what it is, has already died, and from this position recreates a world through a radical formulation of love via a confrontation of the speaking body and knotting that replaces Oedipal logic. In the 14th century writings of the anchorists, we can see a radical politics of love where love operates as a constitutive fullness from and within the body, and this arguably can be opposed to an Antigonean conception of desire and lack. In Julian, every human is an embodied sensory being united with the fullness of the soul created by God. And the highest part of the soul, its substance or essence, remains grounded in God and his uncreated being. Moreover, as far as God created the human soul, there's nothing metaphysically more like God than the human soul. The human soul is actualized into its essential substance by partaking in a love of all created things in the universe. And in short, love and the soul are bound up with creation and invention. Julian of Norwich's notion of an embodied soul united to a sensory being is grounded in time. This can be compared to how the body politique, or collective body of beings, exists in a collective historical and political sense. In Julian of Norwich's ideal society, human beings are united by love for each other, reflecting God and Jesus's undying and unconditional love for humanity. But what is interesting is how this love manifests itself in Julian. Indeed, in darkness, Julian has visions of Christ's body and head bleeding profusely, and this vision of Christ's bleeding body represents the collective community of the church. Although Julian recognizes the failures and shortcomings of the church in her time, she does not give up on a vision of a church that provides a more perfect redemptive vision for humanity. Although Julian is referring to the church qua the Catholic Church, tied to the material aspect of Jesus's body, we extend the notion of the human community implied by the church to a more widely encompassing view, inclusive of all human beings, regardless of their spiritual or religious denomination or lack thereof. This view more closely follows Julian's conception of Wanyoung, which knots all human souls together in the love of God. It's important to note that Julian's conception of Wanyoung of the soul as the likeness of every human soul to that of the creator is basically a knot of Wanyoung, and it unites all souls that are conjoined in their essence as souls that are created and sustained by God. Within the body politic of Christ, all human souls are united towards the final end state of heaven, in which there is justice and salvation. This is eschatological apokatastasis, which means that all souls are saved and none are excluded or sent to hell. This is precisely what made Julian so dangerous to the establishment. Indeed, her symptomatic statement, "all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well," gave it a sense that sin and evil were necessary and all souls will avoid hell. This hope stemmed from the knot that sought to create a new social order that appeared with her confrontation with the body in her solitude. The theology above is at best anachronistic, but there is something about her relationship to what Lacan calls the pailetta, the speaking body, that allows us to see her philosophical and psychoanalytic value for our current crises of the ones all alone and the capitalist discourse. We can suggest that she is representative of an alternative Antigone who can show us how to escape the horror of the Latouchian paradigm we are in. She is representative of the one who can speak from the knot via the body. In other words, she shows how to replace that Latouche with a symptom and then transform inward turning enjoyment into the possibility of inventing a new social link. In other words, if Antigone in her psychoanalytic act says no to the law and symbolic order as one who refuses to give up on her desire, then what we see in the wonder of Julian is one who sees that desire is gone. All there is left is oneness. In other words, the body is singular, and from this point, there is a choice to affirm it all in the fullness of its positivity. Indeed, we can see this from the very beginning. Unlike Antigone, she enters her enclave already in the fullness of death. Nearly all of her adult life was completely isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. To be selected to live in this specific vocation as an anchorite was a very difficult process, because after being selected, there would have been a special ceremony, and psalms would have been sung as she was led to her cell. This ritual, in essence, was a celebration of her death. She was literally to be sealed in a wall for the rest of her life in a state of living death. During her time, the plague spread throughout Europe. It was a time of distraction, disruption, and a sense of apocalypse as people experienced death and destitution on an almost daily basis. Moreover, according to Frederick Christian Bauerschmidt, there was a rising nominalist conception of God, where God's power took precedence over all else, while concepts such as love became an expression of an arbitrary divine will. This went hand in hand with the terrifying idea of a last judgment, where people already terrified by brutalizing conditions had to face the prospect of offending God and ending up in perdition. Our thesis is that we cannot separate the radical impact of Julian's message of essentially upending and overturning a problematic ideology from her decision to conceal herself, give up her world, and create a new world altogether from love. Unlike Antigone, whose relation to the father is one of resistance and a refusal to give up her own desire, Julian is somebody who is already enjoying death, and she finds that the more she seeks out the transcendent signifier of God, the more her gaze is drawn to the battered and bloody body of Christ on the cross, which begins to speak to her. In short, the more she seeks out God's absolute signifier, the more she is drawn to the singularity and opaqueness of Christ's body. Moreover, Bauerschmidt argues that there is a transposition between how Julian's body begins to speak in affect with that of Christ. The very body itself becomes a text, a foundation that becomes the point from which we can build a new social link. For Julian, Jesus' crucified body is a concrete reality to which she clings for solace and the mysterious hieroglyph that she incessantly probes and questions. It is a body whose mysteries seem beyond articulation, not because it is beyond words, for it is precisely as the word of God that Jesus is crucified, but because in the image of the crucified Christ, Julian is presented with what Paul calls the logos to staru in 1 Corinthians 1:18, which may be read as both the word of the cross and the crucified word, God's disarticulated eloquence. So we see in Lacan Seminar 24, which roughly translates to that love is the failure of the one blunder, that he attempts to move from the singularity of Joyce in symptom creation towards a movement where enjoyment of the symptom is transformed into love. Love is therefore less about Lacan's earlier understanding as giving something you do not have to someone who does not want it, but becomes synonymous with a space for invention. As Veronique Beroux writes, love in psychoanalytic theory has three dimensions: imaginary, love invested in the reversal movement of ego libido, the classical Freudian interplay between identification and object choice; symbolic, love as the supposition of knowledge at the heart of transference and thus of the possibility of analysis, although it supports the fiction of the existence of the other; and finally, of the real, love of absolute difference, the one that makes jouissance condescend to desire. The failure to love ascribed to Joyce would refer to this third kind of love, which Lacan tells us sometimes comes about at the end of analysis, love beyond law. And can we not see this imperative now in a post-COVID world? Indeed, all around us, we see economic catastrophe after catastrophe, prices skyrocketing, and anger fermenting at the thousands upon thousands of deaths. But what we see now is less a need to return things to the way they were, but an inchoate sense of creating a world from the ashes that we find ourselves in. People are organizing strikes again. Indeed, as of writing, there is talk of a general strike in England, the first one in over a century. People are beginning to see that meeting body to body and face to face can communicate something beyond the endless play of written words that the alethiosphere demands. Communities are pulling themselves from enforced isolation and the circular enjoyment towards creating a new radical social link. This is only a possibility, and we could still slouch towards more neoliberal brutality, given that we know how its violent plasticity can melt all hope and love into the air. But as we embrace the end of our world, as it already has happened, with all the horror and violence that this has entailed, we need to learn to speak again in a way that opens a space for radical invention. In one of the most beautiful statements Lacan said in Seminar 8, he said, "The hand that extends towards the fruit, the rose, or the log that suddenly bursts into flames, its gesture of reaching, drawing close, or stirring up is closely related to the ripening of the fruit, the beauty of the flower, and the blazing of the log. If in the movement of reaching, drawing, or stirring, the hand goes far enough towards the object, that another hand comes out of the fruit, flower, or log, and extends towards your hand. And at that very moment, the hand freezes in the closed plenitude of the fruit, in the open plenitude of the flower, or in the explosion of a log which bursts into flames. And what is produced is love." In our reading, our very reaching outward from isolation is a movement of hope. And in that movement, we can create the radical space of invention, a space, a positivized void, synonymous with what Lacan called the past, and we can call love. And it'll allow us all to say all shall be well in the face of ingrained impossibility.
Yeah, that's the paper, and we've shared the script if anyone wants to take and read it as well. But that's the idea. Thank you very much, Wanyoung, and thank you for allowing us to be able to present it, Daniel, and thank you very much, Wayne, for allowing us the opportunity to present our work.
I'd like to thank you both. That was excellent. Very fascinating kind of contemporary consideration of the relevance of Antigone. I think this is a good way to kick off this conference. We have Zupančič, we have Žižek, we have Mari Ruti, all talking and referencing, I think, or I assume, the politics of Antigone, which in an interesting way was a very, very important form of politics during the early 2000s period, but which in a sense has kind of retreated. So it's nice to reinvoke the tragic paradigm and to incorporate Julian of Norwich as an alternative model is something I don't think has ever been done. So I want to invite others, either in the masses on YouTube or participants, to comment, ask any questions. We have a few minutes. I also would invite the other panelists to make a comment as well. And you can do so by just sort of hopping in or chatting.
I'll just say I realized that there is a presentation in terms of reading off the script and how we read it off. It might be hard to know, but anyone who wants the script, I'm happy to send it to as well. That's so if anyone needs it. But I'm just saying it's I'll make it available. I'll share my academic.
Okay, great.
And I'll share it also in the chat.
Okay, great. So are there any questions? Dwayne, did you have any comments you wanted to jump in with?
No, I guess the one question I would have is the question that Daniel asked me, because I was giving a little talk for the study groups a few weeks ago, and I don't know why I ended up turning to Antigone, and then I discovered Alenka has this wonderful book that just came out on Antigone. Why do you think it's in the air right now? Why are so many people returning to Antigone as if it ever went away?
Well, I can, and then you maybe accept it. But I think today, with the amount of, I've got a very sort of pragmatic view on it. I think that the amount of crap that everyone's going through, and the amount of horror that people go through, like crises on top of crises, people want to find different ways of rebelling. I think that it's very much in the air precisely because we want to look back and find out, well, look at different historical figures who know how to rebel, and how do we go about it. I think that I think that's how it comes about. Yeah, I mean, what do you think?
I also think it has to do with rebelling against symbolic order, and there are various structures in place that have failed us in different ways. So we are trying to look for alternate sources of meaning and structure. So I would say that's why it's relevant.
But also what's interesting, I was watching the film the other day. That film that's on Netflix, Don't Look Up. Everyone's seen that. Everyone's like, there was a big hoo-ha about it a while ago. But what's really interesting is that the scientists in it, the scientists are these sort of Antigone-like figures screaming, no, you can't, no one's listening at all. And they're trying their very best to sort of try and make something happen, or just but they're screaming ethics. They're screaming their ethics out and shouting. But the reality is that isn't what our world's like today. It's not that everyone's distracted with little cat videos and their own idiotic enjoyment, right? It's that everyone thinks that they're these ethical scientists, shouting on their own platform about how important it is. It's just that it gets completely caught up and commodified in the aliosphere, the digital paradigm that we're in. Everyone's on their platform. Everyone's an Antigone. I don't know if that answers the question. I just went off on a tangent for a while. I apologize.
It was wonderful. Thank you both.
Great. Any other comments? I know that we can check the chat from participants. I hope the chat is working. If it's not, please let me know. Here we go. We have one from Simone. Would you be able to speak more about the affinities between Julian of Norwich and Lacan when it comes to the question of love, particularly the real dimension of love, which Lacan describes as love, I can't read that word, something ontological, and the love which makes up the non-sexual, the sexual non-relation?
Well, for me, I mean, that's I think Lacan says in Seminar 23, there is no such thing as it's very, you know, we all know that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, but he does say that there is a relationship to the synthome. He says there is a such thing as a sexual relationship to the synthome, and what I got from what I understand, you know, and I believe that, you know, this person's great in talking about Julian of Norwich, you know, being located with the idea of the love and the real, and ultimately, how do we move from the isolation that we're in to go outwards, right? And Julian of Norwich represents that, what I believe, the love which is in the last Lacan, which is in Seminar 24. Love is the failure of the one blunder, or love is the failure of the one conscious. It's this idea that if you are trapped in the synthome is circular, and in this process of self-naming, then that you end up in a sort of solipsistic, isolatory reality. Okay, Joyce just laughing away on his typewriter. How do we move out of that? And I think that in Seminar 24, Lacan is saying, it's a question of invention. So love is a question of invention. It's a field of invention. So it's about inventing a symbolic. You know, that's what I think. But again, it's something I probably need to go back and read more on, and it's something Dwayne probably knows a hell of a lot more about as well, since he's written a whole book on love and the real love.
Excellent. And can you provide a link to the paper, because several people have requested that they want to read it?
I sent it in the. I can. How can I? I think what I'll do is I will upload it. Will there be some sort of? I've uploaded to the host. Is it? Are you? Who's? Sorry.
Yeah. If you have a link, that would be great, and we
I'll
can
set
post
one
it
up
at
now.
some point.
Bear with me 1 second.
Or what can be done actually is if you just share it with everybody instead of just the host and panelists, it'll go to everybody there's like 200 people here, and one of them will share it.
I've got hosts and panelists, but there's no option on there to there's no all option. There's no.
Okay, yeah, that's all good. We can figure that out later.
Okay, well, the point
yeah.
I've got, I'm happy to share the script. You know.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Any other comments from either our panelists, from Dwayne, Matthew, Alenka is with us, Gabriel? Okay, I think then what we will do is move to our next talk. And then when we're done with our next talk, after Q&A, we'll take a little short break. So if it's okay, I would like us to pivot to our next presentation. Let me introduce you all to our next speaker, who we're very excited is with us. Dr. Kiara Kremen is a senior lecturer of sociology at the University of Auckland. I hope that's the most up-to-date affiliation for you. Her work spans a range of topics, from Marxism, video games, feminism, gender studies, all through the lens of critical theory. She has written on Žižek's work, and Žižek has written on her work, and they have had interesting exchanges and debates. This is part of the reason why we wanted Dr. Cremin to join us. It is about 5 a.m. for her. So hopefully she's very caffeinated. And the title of the presentation is Woman, the Part of No Part in the LGBT plus Signifying Chain, or Femininity as Constitutive Negation.
Okay.
Welcome
Can
and thank
hear me?
you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Actually, it's T in square brackets, woman. Thanks for inviting me to the symposium, Daniel. I'm not sure I'm going to be invited to another one after this, but we shall see. I've got a lot to go through, but hopefully it'll make sense and there'll be plenty to talk about. So, the erasure of T by so-called LGB activists underlines a point I want to make in this presentation, that trans people are the part of no part in the signifying chain, the exception that politicizes sex, gender politics, and reveals both a conscious and unconscious unease with transgender and trans women in particular, my focus. This, I want to argue, stems from something more fundamental, a fear of the feminine. Trans women are the go-to soft target at the center of the cultural wars, the so-called cultural wars. Instead of questioning trans identities or demanding that trans women justify their status, and I say this with some irony, the properly dialectical and psychoanalytic procedure is to ask why cis people, those who identify with the gender given at birth, are so invested in and concerned about trans women in the first place. Not all cis people, of course. After all, trans women make up a tiny fraction of the population. The point is to interrogate those unconscious investments, one could say surplus enjoyments of cis people in trans women. Now, when people misgender me, I tend to let it slide. Usually they quickly correct themselves and apologize. Those enjoyments are more apparent in those who obsessively cast aspersions on trans identities, even making careers from their unconscious investments in trans women, on whom evidently they depend on for their status and enjoyment of what they consciously conceive to be an existential threat. And in some ways we are. Žižek himself plays to the gallery. I guess this is where the controversy begins, taking every opportunity, it seems, to cast aspersions on trans women. In his latest book, equating what he calls cross-dressing to a white person blacking up their face and declaring they are black. It reminds me of a Marx Brothers joke. It looks transphobic, it sounds transphobic, I think we know where this is going. Don't let it fool you, it is transphobic. And Žižek later adds the qualification, the Lacanian one, that woman is a mask in effect with no ontological core. So whether you are cis or trans, there is no woman as such, only the symbolic means to which the void of being is masked. It should be noted, however, that while he's clearly troubled by the idea that trans women are women, he has no issue with cis women identifying as women. Cis women, it seems, are real women, real with a capital R, whereas trans women are self-deluded imposters. Why not mock cis women's gender identity too? The misogyny would be too obvious. It's easier to disavow when it comes to trans women. We are, after all, the soft targets. And Lacan's sexuation theory has many uses, including, I think, here, as an ideological device for both masking and justifying trans misogyny. So my love of feminine things and subsequent identification as a woman, and I grant this is, as a good Freudian, is likely symptomatic of unconscious repression. I can imagine that formative moment in early childhood when fascinated by the colors, scents, and shapes in my mother's half-open makeup drawer, but upon reaching out to see what's inside, my mother slams the drawer shut and says, "No, that's not for you." Why? which of course is going to have the effect of stoking a curiosity as to why they are forbidden. We all love colors, shapes, and flowery scents, but why are these denied to me and not others? When it comes to sex males, the superego is not the permissive authority that says, enjoy. Personally, then, I reject the idea that my gender as a woman has a provenance in nature. Some trans women take a different view, and that's their business. Who am I to say, no, you're wrong? And like some Jehovah's Witness thrusting Seminar 20 in front of their face and tell them, you got to read this, sis. I have no interest in how people explain their gender orientation. What does concern me is the criteria on which the medical profession and the proverbial big other, the cis gaze, accepts or rejects our gender orientation. It is cis people who are fetishistically invested in trans identities and also professionally empowered to deny them. Žižek has such a positive effect on my own thinking. I love the way he takes us on a familiar pathway, a common sense, if you will, and then adds that signature twist, putting our investments in sharp relief. But when it comes to trans, there is no twist here, just the trite and banal assertions and reactive tendencies that play to the transgender baiting gallery. Transphobia, or to be more precise, transmisogyny, draws from the same libidinal wellspring as racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism. It is a canary in the coal mine, alerting us to the fears and the resentments, the microfascisms, as Deleuze and Guattari aptly put it, plaguing feminists and the political left just as it does the right. In other words, we think we're being good critical leftists, calling out the prejudices and delusions in others without recognizing the fascists within. Libidinal ego investments that manifest in authoritarian tendencies on the left and political movements and parties. The phallic investments in status, power, and domination of a masculine sexuality. A masculinity that is inherently toxic, and that a transmisogyny alerts us to. So identify as a trans woman, not out of choice, but out of necessity. I cannot inhabit this symbolic space as a cis woman would. I cannot enter a woman's rest room dressed in masculine clothing as a cis woman could without provocation. I'm down for dressing in a stereotypically feminine way, but cannot do otherwise if I'm to use such spaces. In this respect, trans women are conscious of symbolic mandate in ways that cis people arguably are not. They do not so much demand the name, the cis other compels it. Yet according to Žižek, and this is a kind of response to my first book on this topic, Man-Made Woman, trans women do demand a name, and because demands for an entity are in the masculine register, he's found them out. They're not feminine at all. I cannot, as he rightly points out, escape the law of signification by having no name. Yet by demanding one, my sexuality is all phallic. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now, Lacanians are quick to point out that Lacan's sexuation theory has nothing to do with gender. They tell us that masculine and feminine sexuality denote a relationship to objet pédia, the remainder after signification, not the gender binary. Hence, there is no sexual relationship. Žižek needs to read this stuff. I think they protest too much. For really, when talking about actual men and women, is this qualification made? Terminology that unproblematically and without qualification maps to binary gender concepts is not deployed out of convenience. It has epistemological weight. And I would agree that under patriarchy, the anatomical male is typically socialized to be all in the phallic masculine function. But this point is already made, nor are the conditions and consequences of our sexuation and gendering in the capitalist white supremacist patriarchy subject to much analysis or interrogation in this respect. And this, I want to just refer to Bell Hooks, and she said that patriarchy demands of boys and men that they commit acts of psychic self-mutilation. And if they don't do it to themselves, others do it to them. It's a mutilation of qualities that contingently are associated with femininity, caring for others, tenderness, kindness, love, all the qualities perhaps that a good parent would want to nurture in their child, irrespective of their genitalia. But we can be sure that if not school, mass media, peers, and so forth, will actually effectively gender us. And the male is, in this sense, a victim of patriarchy too. And we can think about all those massacres in the US. They're invariably committed by self-entitled, inadequate, white, cis boys and men, and never of extremely rarely cis women, trans women, or trans men, who often take their own lives afterwards. For as we all know here, the real man with a capital R is a dead man. By killing themselves, they're no longer subject to the symbolic law, no longer subject to humiliation. So it is not homosexuality as such that society has a problem with, but something, as I'm saying, that runs deeper: femininity. This is where I think the issue people have with trans women lies. And here I want to invoke Freud, who made this admission at the end of his life. He said the repudiation of femininity in both men and women is the greatest obstacle to successful therapy. And we can think, maybe sort of interpreting this, that with men it's the stunting of the wealth of emotions associated with femininity, the psychic mutilation, essential to mental health, well-being, and of course, the well-being of others. Where women, it's an ingrained inferiority complex and a need therein of a strong man. And we can invoke the feminine hysteric in this respect. It's not that she doesn't want a master, it's that the master isn't good enough. You know, she wants a better daddy, a better man, and so goes the man into manning up. And in that respect, because he can never be the man, she functions as his missing phallus, as Alenka Žižek puts it, his missing half. So is this a natural condition or condition of Oedipalization, a secondary or a primary process, historical or ahistorical? We need to make up our minds on this. So, you know, in terms of me identifying and living as a woman, this has had a profound effect on others. I'm a social being after all, which in turn has a profound effect on me, my own sensibilities and interpersonal relationships. A perspectival shift occurs. The same object, let's say gender, is seen from a radically different perspective. And this, as I say, has transformed my life and my relationship to others. It was a change that before I came out, or when I even came out first, was neither desired nor willed. But you know, we can say that perhaps in a Lacanian sense, changes occurred in my imaginary and symbolic identity. I identify as a woman. I want others to identify me as woman, and I strive to represent an idea of femininity. The objects I desire signify femininity in this symbolic constellation. And I no longer have a need or desire, at least consciously, I could say, to associate myself with signifiers that connote masculinity. And that for me is what's so liberating, that I no longer have to be or affect the idea of man. We could say it's a process of sexual healing. It's a therapy that takes place on the streets rather than on the proverbial couch. A street therapy that doesn't cost money. Is the unconscious fantasy then undergirded my masculine investments traversed? Has new symbolic content replaced it? Is lipstick my new phallus? Am I enjoying the symptom of those unconscious repressions, or non-phallic enjoyment? Am I enjoying the synthome, my becoming woman knotted into my being a woman? So what do we learn from Lacan here? That his theories of sexuality are ambiguous and subject to multiple interpretations and misinterpretations. Yet I cannot help but note the extraordinary and dare I say, painfully articulated lengths Lacanians go to deny the possibility of a non-phallic enjoyment. The feminine position, we learn, is inescapably phallic. Žižek tells us that in the latest book. Those who suggest otherwise, who suggest there is a non-phallic enjoyment, are essentially misogynistic men projecting a goddess fantasy on women. This is Lorenzo Chiesa says that recently. And there's no escaping this, is there? My problem, it should be stressed, is not necessarily with Lacan, but how Lacan is deployed to rationalize what could provocatively be suggested is an irrational investment in masculine sexuality, an unconscious, socially contingent androcentrism. While admittedly, this is just another hypothesis, I prefer to approach sexuality on a different perspectives, a perspectival shift, if you will. That not only is a non-phallic sexuality possible without recourse to the phallus, in the final analysis, it is essential to health and well-being of society. I'll go even further. In its surplus enjoyments, masculine sexuality is capitalistic through and through. It ensures capitalism in its different moments of circulation, production, consumption, and so forth. In its acquisitive nature, and I guess this is kind of Deleuze Guattari's critique of Lacan, but I think it applies to masculine sexuality. Masculine sexuality reproduces class, racial, and gendered forms of domination. Feminine sexuality, inclusive of the signifiers associated with femininity, is by contrast communistic. In that respect, the idea of a kind of narcissistic, self-aggrandizing, competitive male is pretty incompatible with a kind of utopian idea of communism. So what I'm saying there is there's an unconscious fear of fascination with and dependency on the feminine. Reconciliation with the feminine is essential, but the obstacles, institutional, subjective, the ideological and repressive state apparatuses are formidable, and they cannot be overcome in the current constellation. Though we can actually, in respect to transphobia, see in those who are present within parties and movements, those who rise to the top, are invested in these ways, are at risk, and they need to be marginalized, or at least their energy channeled. So what does this mean in the here and now in respect to trans? That despite or because of ourselves, without qualification, to fully identify with and affirm trans women, as we would Jews, Black people, Palestinians, and so forth. If you can't do that, question yourself, not trans women. Trans women and femininity in particular, both in respect to gender and what we associate with femininity today, and sexuality, is to LGBT what the proletariat is to class society. The proletariat is subordinate to the bourgeoisie, but also the linchpin that enables self-valorization and endless accumulation, etc. Femininity is subordinate to and essential to masculine sexuality, masculine domination, androcentrism. So just as the ultimate goal of the proletariat and the class struggle is to enact its own erasure, to make the very categories of class redundant, so too an affirmative femininity, to erase or rid society of the power to name and shame our sex. When I can dress as a woman without being recognized or named as trans, when a person with male anatomy can dress in feminine items, or what is considered feminine in the symbolic constellation, without causing cognitive dissonance, that's when such labels will no longer be required. This would effectively mean the end of the gender binary history, when sex organs are no longer designated or marked as a gender and have no determining effect on our lives. LGB depends on and is invested in the T that it fetishistically relies on. It is T that politicizes the chain of signifiers. It is only through the feminine, the passing through of the feminine, a vanishing mediator, the fear of which is manifest in transmisogyny, that all such signifiers are not so much erased, but made redundant. And what I'm describing here, I guess, is a communistic subjectivity, a non-phallic jouissance with no recourse to or dependency on a phallic sexuality. I mean, I know this is going against the grain of Lacan, I'm going to get whipped for this, I'm sure. A non-hysterical femininity. A society, in other words, in which there is no masculine sexuality as such, but just as with class, in a classless society, only the possibility of a masculine sexuality. We're all feminized in that sense. So, and I can't help but do this. Our new thesis 11. Lacanians have hitherto only theorized feminine sexuality. The point is to interrogate their own investments in masculine domination and the repudiations of femininity as such, upon which their libidinal economy and the libidinal economy of capitalism depends. And I'd like to end with a plea to Žižek, and unfortunately he's not here now, but I hope he gets to see this. And those present, a plea for transphobic intolerance. Do your homework, read the gender critical literature, read people like Sheila Jeffreys, not skimming for nuggets that justify your position, but to properly interrogate their claims. For I'm sure you'll find how untenable these positions are. They read like conspiracy theories with parallels to how people justify racism and anti-Semitism. Also read transgender theory written by transgender people. It really is worlds apart. But most of all, interrogate your own investments in trans women. And if you can't do that, you really have nothing worth contributing. And I say this to Žižek as a comrade, a friend, though I'm not sure I'll be one after this. Man, shut the fuck up. You know, just stay out of it. And you know, has anybody ever said to you no? But you know, I guess by saying that, I'm goading you into into doing precisely what I'm arguing against. Maybe I should say, you know, you may offend people, Žižek, but you know, do as you please. So, but if Žižek says too much, those who follow his work, and maybe that relates to people here in this room, people listening to me now, they're still switched on. People who follow his work do not say enough. The silence on Žižek's interventions is palpable. Where are the little boys to point out the nakedness of his transphobia? So, will the hysterics in this room please stand up and distance yourself from Žižek, at least on this issue, and declare solidarity with trans women? If that makes you feel uneasy, then perhaps you too have a problem with trans, or a problem in your slavish commitment to Slavoj. If communism is to be more than a fantasy, and therefore a hypothetical possibility, then the non-phallic, post-capitalist sexuality must also be hypothesized. The future is feminine, or we are truly fucked. And that's a plug for my book, The Future is Feminine, where a lot of these ideas are unpacked. Thank you, everyone. Phew.
Oh, wow. Great work. Thank you so much, Dr. Cremin, for that very, very powerful intervention. We have many questions that have come through on the chat. I want to begin with the other speakers and invite anyone to jump in. I appreciate the frankness by which you accuse, or rather point out, Žižek's, I guess, complicity in this, I guess you could say, transphobic turn. And I feel as if we need an entire symposium on that theme in order to flesh it out. And I do think that it's quite worth fleshing out.
Much else. And much
Sorry?
else. And much else.
And much else, yes. Let me turn to others. I don't want to hog the floor. Dwayne or Gabriel, Matthew, Wanyoung, please. I think I will actually then begin with a few very excellent questions. The first from Rafaela. How can we respond and point the radical difference, if they are indeed radical, between the identity categories of gender and race that could explain and justify why trans race is not to be put in parallel with the transgender question? This is from Rafaela Cruz.
Sorry, so trans race, did you say?
Yeah, like, you know, Rachel Dolezal, for example, a few years ago, I think is one interesting example of someone who came out as, I guess you could say, trans race, white person identifying, insisting that they be identified as Black person. I suppose this is what Rafaela is referring to. I think it is. Yeah,
and I find this just trite baiting. There's so many levels on which this is problematic, and I'm not even going to respond to it. So, yeah, I prefer not to.
Okay.
Work it out for yourself.
Sure, that's fair. That's definitely fair. The next question from Jan Granier, I think it is do you think this tendency to attack the category of the transgender woman is not necessarily a manner to condemn what they call molecular becomings, which is a concept from Deleuze and Guattari, but instead one to unconsciously defend molar aggregates and categories from being transformed. So have you thought about it in this kind of conceptual framework of Deleuze and Guattari between the distinction between molecular and molar becoming?
Yeah, totally. And I engage with that in my book. I think that, yeah, I mean, I'm with Deleuze here, and I'm with I guess Lacanians, Foucauldians, etc. I don't see gender as ontological, as natural. I think it's problematic. But as I say, I don't think that there's any point or place or need to challenge those and who do regard gender to be natural. For me, yeah, the molecular becoming is essential. I guess for me, the identifying as a woman, calling myself a woman is part political, out of necessity because of the experience I encountered of transphobia and people calling me he and Colling and my former name and so forth. And because it is in respect to how I was gendered, I think a move that is liberating for me personally. It's a way to engage on this issue, but ultimately it's a becoming towards becoming imperceptible, I guess I'm saying, where these categories don't define us and don't condition our lives. And in some ways, I think there are parallels between Deleuze and Guattari and Lacan, maybe on feminine sexuality, maybe on synthome. I don't recall them ever engaging with synthome. And yeah, so it's I think maybe we can find common ground in respect to overcoming these restricted binary notions and freeing ourselves of the constraints that we encounter from early childhood.
Great. We have another very sophisticated question from Simone Medina Polo, which I will read. In a piece in the recently published Transgender Marxism set of essays, Zandra Metcalf offers a distinct reading of Freud's perverse polymorphous sexuality, where she looks to reframe the question from how is the existence of trans people possible to how is the existence of cis people possible. Now, given that there is no pure naturalization or culturalization of the drive for either transness or cisness, would that change significantly change the way in which we bring certain presumptions into inquiries about the drive? Does this change in question actually offer psychoanalysis of trans people something distinct to grasp onto?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, the whole point, as I see it, of Freud's interventions is not to analyze people like me, the exception, if you will, but the norm. How did we ever get to become normal, heteronormative, etc., in the first place? And there's nothing natural in normality. And I guess, again, it seems sort of pretty unorthodox in Lacanian circles. There's so much hostility towards him, but I sometimes think of Marcuse here. And yeah, Marcuse, is the unholy trinity of psychoanalysis, Hegel and Marx, as with Žižek. And I think there's kind of maybe a narcissism of minor differences here. So, can the the drive, I think, isn't divorced from the social, and Marcuse talks about the radical reconstitution of the pleasure principle of the primary drive. I kind of guess the way I say it, and maybe this is a response to transgender Marxism, is that I'm not. It sort of talks about discrimination and so forth. But I'm not sure that it locates trans misogyny as a necessary symptom of capitalism itself. And I guess because I'm linking back to this fear of the feminine, the problematic relationship that we have towards the feminine. I mean, this notion of this fear is quite common. That we can actually say that capitalism is not simply patriarchal, it relies on an androcentrism. And that's maybe where we can make a link with the idea that capitalism is incompatible with a society in which we're all transgender, in which we all express ourselves in these ways. So I'm not sure that answers the question. I mean, it's a really good one and it's a complicated one, but maybe we can talk further at a later stage.
Okay, great.
Can't hear you.
Great. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Wonderful. This has been excellent. Many positive comments for you on YouTube as well. I want to remind other speakers, feel free to jump in. Let's see here. We have another question I can read, if it's okay. Daniel Berry says, would not the Žižekian reply to Dr. Cremin's thesis, nothing to do with gender whatsoever and everything to do with sex and sexual difference as such? So yes, can you talk a little bit about the emphasis that Lacanians place on sexual difference and how gender plays into that? How do you theorize that difference?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sort of finding the Lacanian idea of sexual difference in itself problematic. I think maybe it can be historicized. But when you read Lacanians and Žižek as well, he constantly slides into the gendered language. So when he's talking about sexuation, and he mentions women and men, he is literally talking about, okay, put it in Deleuzean terms, molar men and women, without qualification. So in his book, he sort of locates cis women and trans women as feminine. Well, there's no, how can we presuppose that? You know, a trans woman can be in the masculine, a trans man can be in the feminine in this respect. And I kind of think there needs to be a qualification when these terms are used, because it's not, as I say, simply that they're being used out of convenience, because it's just easy to say it that way, but there is serious implications there. And moreover, I find, and this is maybe a challenge to the Lacanians here. I mean, it's all well and good talking about Lacanian theory and philosophizing about Antigone and so forth, but for me, I don't know if this is heterodox, but for me, the value in Lacan is in its application, is in how we deploy it to address real social issues. So for me, sexuation theory is not much interest unless it can relate to gender. And I think it does relate to gender insofar that we could say there's a tendency, and maybe the majority of those who are born with a penis who are sexed in the masculine register. Hence why the overwhelming number of men, boys and men, cis boys and men who commit massacres. I mean, there's a Lacanian explanation for that, and it's masculine sexuality. And so, you know, we can say cis women and are not typically sex masculine. And also I like to add in respect to trans women, you know, trans women don't have a need to prove themselves the alpha male. You know, we don't have a need to go around killing people to be the daddy. So in that sense, you know, that's what, we're not a threat. The same as trans men. You know, trans men typically haven't been socialized in the masculine sexual register. So, you know, there's an explanation for you.
Interesting, very helpful. At one point, Jamie Katz mentions that Žižek said that trans ideology claims to overcome an impossible in an impossible phantasmatic way the dialectical contradiction of sexuation itself. In that sense, could we say that Žižek, in his own formulation, has can assist the trans community to theorize their situation, their subjectivity in a more emancipatory way. Is it possible?
Yeah, I mean, again, I can refer to my own position on this, and I guess my writing, in that I'm sympathetic to Lacan and dare I say also Deleuze and Guattari and Marcuse. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but I just think it's counterproductive to try and insist upon this with people who do take the kind of molar, if you like, ontological position on gender. Let's just not go there. It's like, why do we care? You know, I think this why I want to flip it around. Let's care about cis in that respect. Why are they so bothered? Let's care about how you ever became cis in the first place. Because it's the cis gaze, the cis other that we have to respond to constantly. We're constantly demand to justify ourselves, to explain our womanhood, if you like. But yes, I'm with the idea that there is a use of that. It can be liberating, but Žižek can't be let off the hook in this respect. He doesn't subject cis to the same level of interrogation as he does trans. He doesn't cast aspersions on cis, even though in his latest book he does say cis and trans are subject to the same condition. He's constantly baiting trans, and yeah, I mean, I don't know him personally. He's probably a lovely guy, but you know, it's there and it's repeated, and it's that kind of repetition that tells me there's a problem.
Yeah, this is a big question, which revolves around solidarity, revolves around political ideology, revolves around how we privilege collective suffering, and really makes me link back up with Žižek's early work in the 2000s, which got him banned from writing in the New York Times, which was precisely his critique of liberal ideology.
And he would love to be cancelled, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think he's actually not really cancelable.
He's not, but none of the people who claim that they're being cancelled are. They're normally in elite positions where they have platforms. Žižek is always going to have a platform. He can't be cancelled, and I wouldn't want him to be.
This has been an incredible opening of a lot of questions, which I hope return it throughout our proceedings. I'd like to pause and take a break, and then introduce our next speaker. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will meet at 1:35 Eastern in 5 minutes to hear from Gabriel Tupanamba. Thank you all.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now you can go back to bed if you don't have too much caffeine.
I'll stay on and listen to the others.
Beautiful.
Coffee, yeah, you need coffee.
Yeah, let's take a break. Coffee break.
I will take my break. Welcome. Yeah, thank you.
See you shortly. 5 minutes. Okay, my friends, we're back. Great to see everyone. And again, just on the chat, this is our first like webinar because there's been over 500 people that have actually RSVP'd. So this is a bit new for us, a larger platform than we usually do. And one of our returning guests, speakers, is Gabriel Tupanamba, who's definitely familiar to, I think, most of you. Since the publication of his book, The Desire of Psychoanalysis, which we had the pleasure of launching a symposium on that book, Slavoj Zizek has been engaged in a series of debates and exchanges, some praiseworthy, some critical, on both sides between Gabriel and Žižek. So I assume, Gabriel, you have some kind of response to some of the recent comments in Žižek's latest book regarding The Desire of Psychoanalysis, your work. And by way of introduction, Gabriel Tupanamba is a Brazilian-based psychoanalytic theorist and psychoanalyst as well. He writes widely in issues having to do with philosophy, politics, psychoanalytic thought, Lacanian studies as well. And much more could be said, but he's a great friend of mine, and I'm very happy to welcome Gabriel.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is the microphone all right? Great.
Good.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, for putting this whole conference together. I want to start by saying, stating my absolute solidarity with Ciara, and I do think that I was in this very paradoxical position recently of being really kind of honored for having Žižek comment on my work, but also do it in one of the most embarrassing chapters I've read of his work. So it was a very weird kind of mixed bag of feelings. But also I didn't comment on her presentation just now, because I think in a certain way my own presentation can be seen a bit as a comment itself. I know that the title we chose for the conference, it's, you know, we need to be willing to go to the end, and we hear this kind of catchphrase being used by Žižek often to signal a kind of operation that he often does to great success and amazing insight, which is to challenge a certain concept's reach and kind of apply it, take its application beyond where we would usually take, and with this way, in a kind of Hegelian sense, challenge formal universality from within, right? We thought the reach of the concept was this, well, but if it applies to that other material, that other case, and so on, then the concept wasn't what we thought it was, right? But I wanted to introduce a slightly different perspective, and I was happy to see that I think Ciara is pointing to a similar direction when she says that Žižek should probably shut up about some things, which is the issue of when going to the end is actually a way to cover something up, right? I have in mind here, there's this anecdote I always loved about this Brazilian kindergarten teacher. And she was well known for like her students being really good at drawing, and nobody knew like what her pedagogical method was for this. Like, why did the students get so good at doing these drawings and everyone's children were, you know, really crappy at it? And they asked her, and she said that she was just paying attention to them while they were drawing, and she knew when to take the paper out of their hands, and before they would like scribble over the drawings and make them incomprehensible again. So there is something to this idea that sometimes ideas appear in the middle of the road, and if you continue, you actually scribble over them and to the point that they become unrecognizable. And I think that in a certain sense, that's even, let's say, the principle behind Lacan's variable length session, right? The idea that you take the paper away at the moment that something is at the surface, some kind of paradoxical, unthought form, unthought thought comes to the surface. And that's where you cut the session, right? There's something to this. And I have the impression that sometimes, I mean, and it happens often that, you know, we're either bored by our patients or not paying attention or whatever, and we allow them to continue to go on, to go to the end. And the first thing they do is to say anything that covers up that stumbling block that appeared in the middle of the road. And so when I was thinking about the conference and thinking about, now thinking about Ciara's presentation as well, this idea of, you know, perhaps taking the paper out of Žižek's hand sometimes in the middle of a formulation to sometimes bring something to the surface. I feel like it gives a good kind of motto, a good image to the sort of response I would like to give. I mean, it's just a sketch of a response. I hope to develop this further, but I just wanted to share this approach of a critique with you guys to his comments and his developments, which are, I mean, ridiculously generous about my work in his recent book, Surplus Enjoyment. But at the same time, while reading it, I had a strange feeling that the conversation we're having is always deformed, as if there's like a, you know, like the light being drawn by a black hole, like a strange attractor that just deforms things in a certain direction. So sometimes there are some strange simplifications of an argument, which I think facilitate a retort, like when he suggests, I'm going to go into the book, I'm not assuming anyone knows what I'm talking about, but sometimes he suggests like that there's such a utopian democratic vision of psychoanalysis, and then you can easily counterpose a more realistic contradiction to this, right? And more importantly, this is perhaps what drove me to think of this response and even to answer, even to title the presentation the way I did, was that there is a interesting footnote in the chapter where he says something like, I know that Gabriel didn't say I am a structural dialectician, or he didn't say that I was this thing, but I have the impression that nevertheless, I'm the one who is addressing with these critiques, which I found very weird. Why was he defending himself against critiques I didn't address to him? In fact, most of the time I was addressing to people who are pretty much adversaries of his positions, theoretically at least. And one of the ways I thought about framing this response, and one of the ways I tried to understand why this strange missed encounter might have happened, is that I think also my book is an attempt to unfold an idea that Žižek had along the way, before he got to the end, before he decided to go further. And it just tries to take the paper out at that point. So this is kind of the approach that I'm going to take now. And my idea is I'm not sure how long this will take. I hope it will be short so we can actually talk. And I was going to add a chronometer just to see how long I'm taking. But Daniel, if you could just give me the stop talking sign when I should be done, I'll stop. Okay. So just to give you guys a summary of the book, just so it facilitates clarifying some of these points. The book starts with a definition of something I call the Lacanian ideology, which very simply could be said to be just a sort of repeating position that we tend to occupy with regard to other discourses, other theories and practices. I think a good way of defining what this is in surface effects, and I think, again, in my opinion, this goes very much in line with some of Ciara's comments, is this kind of repeating dynamic where we pose questions to other fields to which only psychoanalysis has the answer, and we already have the answer. So we ask something about what is this phenomenon, what is going on there, and we have in our own kind of bag of concepts some kind of pre-established answer or a new reading of a pre-established concept, and that's the solution to that question, rather than posing questions about psychoanalysis that other fields might have the means to help us develop new answers. So for me, for example, it's a clear kind of dynamic in this very chapter I'm commenting when Žižek treats the between many scarecrows, the trans question, which is already always a bad sign when things become a question in this way. Only a few things are placed in such a condescending and dangerous position, but usually it's done in such a way that then we go back to our field, to whatever we feel more comfortable, and we say, well, the answer is here, right? So we can find it there, but we don't need to focus on Žižek here, and we can find this not only in the works of others, but in my own work, definitely. I mean, I spend a long time acting exactly like this. There is a big problem with class struggle, with capitalism, and so on. There's the question. Now I'm going to look into one of Lacan's seminars and I'm going to find an answer. Rather than having a problem, which is what I have today, I don't know what to do with a bunch of cases that I have, with a bunch of phenomena I don't know how to theorize. And then we might look into other fields for tools to come up with new answers that are not already in a kind of conceptual toolkit, right? So this is what I call Lacanian ideology, this particular way that we generalize our own concepts over every domain of knowledge and every practice, as if that's a good kind of compass to think. Now, my point is that this is not a problem of reading. This is not a problem with Lacanians. This is not a problem with Miller. This is not a problem of Lacan's followers. This is a problem that has an origin in Lacan himself. The book argues that the very concept of signifier, not the thing that it's dealing with, not the analytic phenomena it is naming, but the concept of signifier, the way it's extracted from linguistics and so on, that it lacks proper contours. When you ask a linguist what he means by a signifier, where you apply that concept, it's quite clear what the domain of the concept is. But in psychoanalysis, the moment that we treat speech in analysis under the concept of the signifier, which was developed to talk about the structure of languages in general in other fields, suddenly speech in analysis becomes indistinguishable from speech in general, speech everywhere, right? So my point is that it is this lack of contour of the domain of application of analytic theory that is, let's say, at the origin of what I've called Lacanian ideology. The point is that, of course, this is not a condemnation of the use of the concept of signifier. It definitely advanced analytic thinking like crazy, but it comes with its own caveats and its own collateral effects. So there's good reason to want to advance even further, right, and change things. So in the book, I try to give some proof that there is problems in Lacan himself. So for example, I talk about the fact that we don't have any means to talk about the work or the sort of practice that goes into establishing the clinical setting, establishing free associations. One, this is kind of taken as a given, and what's before this is taken to be before language, which is taken to be therefore in a certain metaphysical, philosophical realm. Nor are we capable with Lacan of thinking what is a non-transferential relation between analysand and analyst, which again, it's something we would have to if we are to think about the practice that establishes the clinical setting. Plus, we also find in Lacan a very slippery kind of idea of where the effectivity of the analytic act comes from. Does it come from the desire of the analyst? Does it come from the patient, like in seminar 15, it looks like, in his theory of the analytic act? Does it come from the social link that constructs the discourse of the analyst? And he tries many different things. So you can see that there is something concerning the domain, the contours of the clinic, which is still something kind of an open problem. We can also find proofs of this issue in Lacanian thought after Lacan, that we didn't solve this. Well, I try to divide between two kind of basic ways we tend to use Lacan. One I call the kind of clinical perspective. The clinical perspective claims that the unconscious is a concept of a singular case. So they are usually people who are practicing analysts tend to take this position. They are very kind of distrustful of philosophical, critical uses of psychoanalysis, but they tend to focus on the unconscious as this kind of concept that points to a singular experience. And we have on the other side what I call the critical or the philosophical paradigm, where the unconscious has a universal characteristic. It points to something that is at stake in almost every situation. It is at stake in examples from many fields. And both of these approaches are very productive. I mean, you get to listen to people in the clinic, you get to unearth new ideas about kind of stale social phenomena. We don't know how to interpret, how to deal with them anymore. New perspectives are open. Both of these are interesting, but it seems like we oscillate between these two things. There's no way of integrating both of them. For clinicians, theory ends up being something you just apply. It very rarely can be developed. It tends to have a secondary role, whereas in critical kind of philosophical approaches to psychoanalysis, the actual clinical practice seems to be either redundant or secondary. There's no novelty there that is of interest to us, right? So besides this oscillation, I think another proof that this is still an open issue for Lacanians is that we have a hard time thinking the role of money in the clinic. We have a hard time thinking the limits of transference. For example, in the same chapter I'm mentioning, Žižek talks about people having transference with a master in a community, then about identifying with a master, but you don't have transference with masters. You have transference with analysts who are not in the position of mastery, right? It's a very different thing. So there is something weird about where the concept applies, where it doesn't, why some traumas seem to be amenable to analytic treatment and others are not, which is a question Catherine Malabou was interested in. But most importantly, the proof for me that this is still an open problem and a serious problem is that we don't know how to recognize novelty in psychoanalysis. So what could happen either in clinical practice or in theoretical work that would make us say, holy shit, this is a novel thing. I don't know where this fits. I would have to look into other fields, to the part of other fields, other practices, or experiences that do not match up with psychoanalysis to learn something from them. So this kind of sets up the problem of the book, right? And then I present 3 ideas in the book. The first idea is that if you go back to the very adoption of the logic of the signifier, first the signifier is a concept, but then when Miller, I think very aptly summarizes it in his early texts, there was already a critique of this coming from Alain Badiou, and a critique that went directly to this point, that what Miller was doing, what Lacan was doing, made a lot of sense if the domain of application was the clinic, but didn't make any sense if it was meant to apply to mathematics, to politics, and other fields. So the first idea of the book is to use this critique to try to start to sketch an analytic concept of the enclosure of the clinical space, the sort of domain of where clinical practice is effective, where concepts are effective, the sort of to circumscribe an experience which all these crazy theories we use are actually trying to describe. And sometimes very stupid questions actually show that it's not very obvious. Like, it's not very easy to find a clinical example of where we use the formulas of sexuation, for example. It's really not that easy. Actually, it's not easy to do this with a lot of Lacanian concepts for discourses and all of this. So anyway, so the domain, to find a domain for analytic theory and for the clinical setting. And I take this kind of engagement with Badiou's critique of Lacan all the way to what I call the generic perspective, as a way to supplement what I call the clinical, right? The unconscious is a singular thing. The critical or philosophical, where the unconscious is this universal property with ontological kind of consequences. And we try to supplement it. It's not a matter of criticizing the two, only criticizing their reach. Supplement it with what I call generic perspective, which is a more historical perspective in the sense, not of historicism, as Žižek accuses my book of doing, but of the sense that Hegel himself would do when he talks about the history of the state, for example, where you have, in a certain sense, the production of a totality. It has its own contradictions. Well, but this contradiction can move. And you can have a history, let's say, of the institutional commitments and the kind of general commitments of psychoanalysis with what can exist, what can be heard in the clinic. To show that this history exists, I think there is a very simple mental experiment we can do, which simply is to look back on people who did the pass or who finished their analysis like in the 1940s, 50s, right, or pass afterwards with Lacan. And if you really believe that analysts who finished their analysis in 1970 are really up to date with their libidinal attachments that go through, you know, the existence of trans people, exactly as Ciara was talking about, or more recent political and social turmoil and how they deal with this, and all sorts of new things that, I mean, what counted as the end of analysis at a certain point surely would still require further elaboration, further working through, if we were to look at it in this new context. So there is something like a history of what counts as a signifier, a history of what is significant to listen to in speech, in analysis. So that's what the generic perspective is, and you see that it mobilizes this idea of the enclosure of a clinic. What counts as speech in analysis and what doesn't count, what is meaningful and what is not, right? The second idea that the book presents is the idea that, well, if you take this idea of a domain of the clinic further, you actually see that we can turn a very kind of general and hermetic field of questions concerning the formulas of sexuation into a pretty much straightforward theory, because we can start saying that the phallic function is not a general function of structure in language and any structure anywhere. It's just the domain of the phallic function is speech under the analytic conditions, speech in free association. In other words, the domain of the phallic function is pretty much the domain of what we get to hear in analysis. Well, if we can interpret the forms of sexuation in this way, as if when we see the range of the phallic function, we're actually seeing the range of speech acts in a clinical setting, we can actually give a very different interpretation of the logic of the all and the non-all, which opens up the idea of the difference between clinical listening and clinical situations that pretty much stay in the realm of what's already structured and we already kind of know how to listen to, and clinical situations where something comes up which is part of clinical work, but we don't know how to structure or how to listen to it without it being an exception. So it's a way of starting to talk about how novelty could emerge in psychoanalysis. One of the more tricky points there is that we don't have the name or the means to conceptualize something like this, because our theory of the real, our theory of exceptions, our theory of inconsistencies, they're all based on a grammar of what I call structural dialectics, which is a grammar of otherness. So once I reach radical otherness with no unity, otherness as the impasse of unity, I have no way of actually further dividing that into two different types of otherness. So I can't really tell apart what is other to a subject and what is other to psychoanalysis. And that's where we want to go. We want to be able to, if there are novelties to psychoanalysis, if analysts are not already private to a knowledge and analysans are pretty much catching up with it, or private to an experience, even if it's not an experience of knowledge, it's the experience of the failure of knowledge, doesn't matter. Well, but we're just waiting analysans to reach us in a certain way, to have that experience as well. That's one thing. Another thing is to suppose that whatever happens in the couch could, in some situation, lead us to a new idea about what psychoanalysis can do, right? A new extension in its history. So this way of thinking about the forms of sexuation implied one thing, which is that the real place, the material basis of the formulas of sexuation are clinical practice. And even when we apply them to sexuation itself, that's the metaphorical use. Then it already being extended beyond its reach, because it's extending to a domain which is people's lives everywhere and not their speech in analysis. Then I end the book trying to connect these two things, the theory of the enclosure of the clinic with the theory of novelties in the clinic, and try to construct an alternative account of what Lacan called the theory of the past. This end of analysis, which is also the formation of new analysts, right? So we kind of take the novelty on the end side of analysis, and we want to plug it back into the formation of the enclosure of clinical space, where we see that it's at stake what counts as significant and what will be insignificant in people's speech. Now, the point that I wanted to make, and again, I'm not sure how long I have, but Daniel, you're responsible for for my good behavior?
Let's say 5 minutes.
Okay, I can do it in a
And then
dramatic way.
questions and
Sure. So the whole point is that I wanted to make is, where did I get all these ideas? Like, where this development coming from? Well, I took these ideas from Žižek, but not from the Žižek that is going all the way to the end, but from ideas that he dropped along the way. And I'm not really sure if some of the work that is coming afterwards is not being used to cover them up. So to start, I use Žižek's theory of the Leninist party as the discourse of the analyst. Well, if you take that idea seriously, the first problem that you have is that usually we use the discourse of the analyst in the position of the analyst to describe a punctual individual position that somebody occupies in a dyadic relation. I don't need to worry about the inner structure of the object A. What's its infrastructural composition? Because I don't need to worry about what makes an individual analyst remain alive. Well, when I'm talking about a collective that works as an analyst, suddenly I need to ask myself, what is the underlying structure that allows a collective of people to occupy a position that we would say is a position of the analyst with regards to some situation? That's actually an idea that Žižek had. So that's where that comes from in the book. Second, it comes from Žižek's own reading of Lacan, when he famously claimed for 30 years now that Lacan was being the most Hegelian when he actually dropped explicit references to Hegel, right? Well, I do this in the book. I don't mention Hegel. And in my case, I don't think I passed the test of being more Hegelian when I don't mention Hegel for Žižek. But the interesting question is, well, the moment that Lacan dropped the references to Hegel was also the moment where he first developed the theory of the past, second, went on to a really crazy, in my opinion, theoretical attempt to solve the problem of how signifiers relate with what's insignificant, which is the whole drama between signifier and enjoyment, which I don't believe he ever solved. But from the standpoint of the Leninist position, the Leninist Žižekian position, we should ask, okay, if Lacan is Hegelian at that point, what is the correlate of the community of believers that Žižek so often used to speak when discussing Žižek's Christology, right? At that point of the Lacanian period. What does it mean to look at the past and the formation of new analysts from that standpoint? And that's what I was trying to do. Third, I took all these ideas from Žižek's own engagement with the communist idea at the time that he was in a strong dialogue with Badiou. And his whole point was to introduce, beyond Miller's theory of the traversal of fantasy that had been his own theory for very long, his whole concern with the day after. Well, I'm trying to give an analytic theory of the day after. I don't mention any of this in the book because I'm not writing a book for Žižekians. Unfortunately, there are very few Žižekians who actually have, clinical practices. And I'm trying to do something for psychoanalysis. So rather than use the references that are good for a philosophical community, I'm trying to address people and promote the movement inside of psychoanalysis itself. But the reason why I think that Žižek didn't read the book in this way is because he himself moved away from these ideas. His engagement with Badiou changed, his engagement with Marx, Lacan, and Lenin changed over the years. And I have the impression that when he read the book in a certain way, that kind of short circuit was in place. I do not argue in the book that Žižek is a structural dialectician because he's not. His theory of the community of believers, he proposed in a Hegelian theory, proposed a theory of collective construction, collective change that could help us rethink political organization in Marxism. But he eventually gave up on this, even though this didn't fit into the structural dialectical kind of approach. I do not argue in the book for a democratic view of psychoanalysis. My whole point is actually to show that the theory of the drives is actually better applied to the structure of the analytic schools themselves, and only afterwards to a metaphysics of what people really are in their being of beings, right? It's a theory of how psychoanalysis gets autonomized from psychoanalysts. And that's exactly the sort of thing that the theory of the community of believers was trying to do. But it's a materialist version of this. I also don't treat, he talks a lot about the idea of the proof of impotence by impotence, through which I criticize Lacan. Lacan, on the one hand, is saying that we cannot tell what, like, there is a radical otherness on the side of the world, a radical otherness in the side, internal to the subject. Since we cannot tell apart two radical otherness, for this would imply they are not that radical, then Lacan unites the two in the theory of the object A, the Mobius strip, and all the stuff. Žižek says that this is Hegel's turn of impotence into impossibility, when you realize some obstacle was actually a property of objective reality itself. This is not true. The proof by impotence is like saying that because I don't understand the language you're speaking, and I don't understand the language that the other person is speaking, the two languages are the same. That's the proof through which I identify two things I don't understand via my impotence to understand them. It has nothing to do with the Hegelian motive, right? Which is not an ahistorical approach. On the contrary, it turns historical obstacles into historical novelties, right? I don't argue against Lacan having philosophical commitments in the book. I argue against Lacan having specific philosophical commitments in the book. He cannot think actual infinity in mathematics. He has a problem with that. He cannot think the idea that things can be impasses to formalization, meaning can be real in his sense, while being themselves formalizable or consistent. Well, this is something Žižek used to think, because his theory of the Leninist party implies this, that something can have a form, we are organized, but we work in the social level as if we are impossible to formalize within a certain social space. So that was actually his own position at some point. And finally, my suggestion that the forms of sexuation can actually be concretely, consistently modeled with better mathematics than the one Lacan did. It's not a matter of undoing classic themes of how the real appears in the all, the non-all, the exception, and the sort of submersion of the symbolic into the real in the non-all. It just divides the real a bit further. We can say a bit more about that. We don't need to be satisfied with what we already know. So I'm running a lot and saying a lot of things. I think I'm just throwing at you guys a bunch of things. I wonder if any of this makes sense. It's a bit narcissistic of me to use this space also to develop a commentary on something that I probably should direct straight at Slavoj and talk to him about it. But I felt like it was a good moment to do so anyway. And thank you very much, everyone.
Excellent. Gabriel, thank you so much. We have several questions coming in from the audience, which I can start with, but I will also remind the other speakers and panelists that are with us to jump in as you wish. But if I don't hear from you in 5 seconds, I will read a question from our audience. A very interesting question has come from Andrew, and Andrew is wondering, Gabriel, you speak about this grammar of otherness in the Analyst Sand. He says, why does a novelty as such that an Analyst Sand may be elaborating or exploring or finding, why would this be necessarily crucial for the development of psychoanalysis in general or even generically?
So why is a novelty that an analyst is exploring? Why is this necessarily, or why should we consider that it's important?
Yeah, you talked about this grammar of otherness in the speech of the Analyst Sand. This is, I could also perhaps invite Andrew to speak if he wanted to elaborate on this question. That might be
sure. I'm reading it now here anyway. I found it in the chat.
Okay.
Well, but if he wants to speak, so I mean, no problem.
Go ahead and give your answer, actually.
Okay. Yeah, my point is, I mean, I don't think I'm proposing anything new. I think what I'm proposing is how things already happen. I just want to have better names for what already happens. well, novelties in things that analysts explore in clinical practice is pretty much where Freud is confronted with a bunch of things that he needs to think about later on and develop concept series and so on. I mean, it doesn't need to be the case. I mean, often I would imagine that most analysis might not change anything in terms of, our theoretical understanding of psychoanalysis. But at the same time, have you guys realized that for the last 20 years, perhaps, we published an unbelievable amount of texts talking about how the world changed. And the correlate of that is usually because we don't know how to treat patients anymore. Like something happens, this was a big topic in the 90s, like there are nebulous subjectivities now. There are subjects with a decline of the name of the father. There are subjects, it's always something worse compared to what we had before. Everyone is like trying their best to go back to a situation we no longer can. And then we come up with a huge social diagnosis to explain this clinical problem. So we do assume that we learn new things through the clinic. It's just that it's always things about others, always things about the social world, capitalism, whatever, never things about psychoanalysis. So why can we learn about everything but never learn anything new about our own field from the people that we're treating? I mean, you can make comparisons with many, many different fields, and it's quite common that we learn things from practicing. So what's up with that, right? So it doesn't need to be the case. And my point with the grammar of otherness, again, it's nothing, there's no practice that follows from this. It's just the way we speak, the way we think about this thing. It's also not an ethical problem, like people do this because they don't want. It's just that if the best way you can talk about anxiety, about this sort of parts of speech that don't fit with the process of signification, the best way we can talk about them is through ultimately an opposition between structure and structuralness. Things that have form and name and things which are other to form, always dependent on this thing. I'm not positing that there's something outside of the symbolic. It's crazy. We're so kind of used to thinking this way that if you ask the question, is the theory of the symbolic the best way to name what we do in clinical practice? People think that you're automatically claiming there's something outside of the symbolic, right? I'm just saying that there is more to the symbolic than the concept of the symbolic, perhaps, or more to what we call radical otherness of the object A than just being other, right? I mean, I think these things were developed in a time where it wasn't so common to point to a bunch of things we don't understand, lump them together, and then say, there is a question of this thing. Right? It's not a good practice in any field, so we shouldn't be satisfied with that.
Very interesting also, Gabriel, this business of Žižek's engagement with the Levinasian turn in the kind of Western Marxism, even of Agamben, and in the Community of Believers work, where this whole theory of the abyssal otherness was developed, and his theory of the radical political act was also developed during the time in which he was making a serious confrontation with theology and with the kind of Agambenian post-Marxism of that early 2000s period, which was deeply contextually driven by the biopolitical state of the war on terror and that kind of broader context and so on. And it's interesting what you do with your notion of generic otherness as well. Again, want to remind Mark or Dr. Cremin or Dr. Roussel to jump in at any point. If not, I'll go back to the masses here. Okay.
So I'll just say something because maybe none of us have said anything up to now, and thank you for that, Gabriel. I did miss part of it, and you may have responded to this. And I read Žižek's critique of you in his latest book. I've downloaded your book, but I've not read it yet. And mentions about the criticism that the therapy is something that can only be afforded by some people, and I just wonder how you conceive of getting around that problem. If you know, psychoanalysis tells us we all need to go through a therapy, how we might overcome that deadlock, we could say. And I guess that's sometimes where I might turn to Deleuze and Guattari in that respect, and the schizoanalysis, and their therapy doesn't rely on the clinic. It takes place, I guess, on the streets, and whether you've sort of engaged with that at all.
Thank you, Ciara. Yeah, I mean, my kind of conflict here, I mean, I'm part and friend with a lot of analysts here in Brazil who are trying different kind of experimental models for clinic in the streets. They mix Lacan and schizoanalysis in different ways as well. But I mean, it's just something I can't really let go, which is the fact that my own analysis was not like that, and it was pretty good. I mean, pretty much saved my life. I don't think most analysts who are doing this in the specific case of Lacanian experiments with public clinics or the use of Lacanian theory in kind of public health system, that they would have been satisfied with the thing that they are providing themselves to others. I do think it's an interesting exercise, but I don't think it changes the fact that there is something specific about clinical practice which I wouldn't like to let go. And then it creates the other problem, which is okay, but there is a limitation to this. And my point is in the book is that I see two paths to deal with this. The first is to recognize how critical this problem is, because if you take seriously, as I do, perhaps Andrew doesn't as much, if you take seriously that there is some reliance on our patients in order for novelties to appear in the clinic, either because we hear things that make us anxious in the clinic, we need to talk to other people, we go back to the books, whatever, or because these patients might become new analysts and hear in new ways their own patients and say new things, and most of all prevent us from saying some things in analytic schools, you know. Without this, psychoanalysis will die, simply because it will get decoupled, detached from reality, right? It's kind of a bit of a sociological problem of the sample of people you listen to, you know, bias in sampling, like it's a useful problem. So I think that it's important to realize the depth of a crisis like this that economic constraints can produce to psychoanalysis. It's not just that it becomes an elite practice. If it becomes an elite practice, it will just die as psychoanalysis. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that I cannot see a way out of this if we think we have all the tools to deal with economic problems. There is hundreds and hundreds of years of political thinking. Why is Lacan the guy I'm going to turn to think the collective organization of analysts to change something? We need to learn how to look at psychoanalysis as an absolutely ordinary practice, just like any other job, and then treat that as we would when we politicize any job, any profession, any group of professionals. I think the level of singularity that we assign to analysts is getting in the way of preserving whatever real singularity the practice has. I don't want to let go of the real part that I find singular about the clinical work. I do think that there's something quite miraculous that I honestly don't think the theory can explain, that happens when you listen to people, even silently, when you intervene. This can have amazing effects. But I think that we do a very crappy job at understanding what material bases support this actual practice and what conditions are required to keep it alive.
Thank you. That's good.
I've wanted to ask Gabriel Tupanamba about Deleuze and Guattari for a long time, but I never had the chance to do it. But I don't know if he'll actually answer straight out what his views are there, but that's okay.
No, I can be very direct about it. I haven't read enough. Like, I don't know. Like, I can people can tell me if it's, you know, what I should read more and so on. I just haven't. I'm not a good expert on it.
Dialogues 2 is a good place to start.
True.
Wonderful. Okay, let us have one more question. I don't know if Dwayne or Mark or anyone else would like to jump in. Happy to also see what we have here. And if I haven't gotten to chats from or Q&A from the audience, I really apologize. Hopefully your questions can be brought up in the future or even tomorrow.
Can I just answer? I mean, there is a question here who's Gabriel, who are you to tell Žižek when to speak and when to shut up?
Yeah.
Just say something, which is the problem, again, with the idea of taking the drawing out is that when you continue to say words after that, you're not really speaking. It's not a matter of asking anyone to stop speaking. It's just that what is being said, nothing is being said. So I wouldn't dare to say who should speak or shut up, but I think I can tell apart when they're saying things that are just kind of spinning in the void, right? Like everyone can, I hope.
Okay, great. Gabriel, thank you very much. You will be here tomorrow, and I'm sure that Slavoj will have some words for you, and hopefully you can have some exchange with him tomorrow.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. All right, we're going to move on, and I guess it's my turn to go. So I will read my paper, and if anyone else can kind of do the general moderation of the chat, I would appreciate it. I don't know how much there is to do, but that would be good. Okay, I'm going to read my paper, and the title I've given this is Žižek, Ideology, Critique, and the Dead End of Post-Marxism. So let me begin. So despite Slavoj Zizek's frequent refrain that we must turn to Hegel over Marx in order to orient our thinking of politics today, I actually want to argue that there is a Marxism still in Zizek's work. And although his politics are often quite erratic and he changes his positions and theories constantly, I do think his political thought is best defined as what I call a post-Marxist pragmatism. Let's review some of the positions that he's developed over the years. And this is not an exhaustive list. It is merely what I see as some of his primary and most interesting positions. And these were developed, and this is the pragmatist part, in a kind of constant interpretive dialectical engagement with the global political situation, especially Zizek's reading of the possibility or lack thereof of emancipatory or radical politics, such as his early discussion of the importance of resurrecting the revolutionary legacy of Robespierre and the necessity, therefore, of terror, which he wrote about in the late 1990s and early 2000s, to his flirtation with a renewed idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat during the period of the movement of the squares and Occupy Wall Street in 2010 to 2014, to his pro-technocratic state socialism as a plea to solve the intractable contradictions of contemporary capitalism, biogenetics, climate catastrophe, etc., to his more recent and modest turn to a social democratic embrace of progressive liberals in the American Democratic Party under the Bernie Sanders movement, which Zizek sees in his latest books on the pandemic as the horizon of emancipatory politics in the contemporary conjecture. I think there are four political orientations that Zizek has polemicized against, which help us see how his post-Marxism is in fact the bedrock of his political orientation. The first is his long-standing critique against liberal, democratic human rights, ethics more generally, including political liberalism, Kantianism, Habermasianism, and just in general contemporary liberal ideology. This is a project which was very central to his work during the War on Terror period from the early 2000s up to 2014. Secondly, there is obviously a consistent critique against the postmodernist turn in cultural theory, cultural politics of identity, and the valorization of difference, Judith Butler, cultural materialism, and to a lesser extent, post-colonial thought. And third, Zizek's politics have to be understood as grappling with what we might call ontological politics, or rethinking the Schmittian category of the political in deconstructivist or messianic terms, which Tupinamba referenced a moment ago as the theological focus of his work. The wholly other community, Levinas, Derrida, Agamben, etc. And fourth is the Deleuzian-oriented post-Marxism of Hart and Negri, which during the alter globalization period was a major emphasis of his thought. So what is post-Marxism? Post-Marxism broadly refers to the legacy of Western Marxism after the fall of the Soviet Union, wherein Western Marxist thinkers have aimed to fundamentally redefine the core categories of Marxist thought, arguing that traditional Marxism must be traversed in order to retrieve what remains most viable in Marxism, to reclaim the legacy of what is truly radical. Now, the predominant tendency that Žižek works under within the post-Marxist umbrella is the Althusserian Lacanian orientation, which we remember Ernesto Laclau wrote the preface to The Sublime Object of Ideology, yet Žižek, over the course of 20 years, broke in sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic ways with Laclau. The second is, of course, Alain Badiou's radical egalitarian anti-statist politics of universality. And the fourth, which we should never forget, is Jacques Rancier's theory of the part of no part, which Žižek has used to reinvent various theories of what the proletariat might be in our own time. I therefore see Žižek's work as an attempt to synthesize these three strains of post-Marxist thought. We remember that the emphasis on the lost causes, a project which was opened by Badiou, where Žižek claimed in a very interesting way that there are four concepts of communism worth retaining: strict egalitarian justice, disciplinary terror, political voluntarism, and trust in the masses, trust in the people. It is these lost causes which Žižek's theory of the political act was focused on resurrecting. Žižek elaborates a distinct Lacanian theory of the revolutionary political act, similar in a way to a kind of radical political leap of faith, but one that is focused on a reactivation of the communist idea for our time. This strain of his thought reached a crescendo in the idea of communism conferences in the early 2010s, and I would argue died in 2014 with the rise of right-wing populism, Corbyn and Sanders. I think that Žižek's synthesizing of these tendencies is one way to understand his well-known comment that we must reverse Marx's thesis 11 to focus on an interpretation of the world before any non-contemplated or too quick of an acting to change the world. Is Žižek's post-Marxism, in fact, a way of refusing something within traditional Marxism as such? Or perhaps it is more likely that Žižek would claim that there are distinct reasons for making this reversal of thesis 11, which go back to Hegel and the need for Hegel to be revitalized through Lacan, which I'm not going to get into. But I will say it is ironic in my view that Žižek's most important theory is a theory of the act, even though he proposes a reversal of thesis 11, which is contemplation before action. So what is this theory of the act? We can say it goes something like this. The contemporary ideological field is pinned down typically by two false choices in a perverse way. But yet there are acts which usually particular individuals, sometimes collectives, are capable of exerting, which can disturb and reveal the real dimension of the situation. Examples of individual Lacanian acts abound in film and television. And I'm not going to get into all of those examples, but if you read Žižek's work, you'll see they are ample. What I find most interesting, and also what is sort of incomplete in Žižek's theory of the act, is that he tries to interpret it in a way as an ethical dimension. In other words, one of the major questions is any theory of the act always on the side of an emancipatory theory of the act? Or can you have a kind of fascistic theory of the act? And from that, Žižek tries to make a distinction between the way in which the core of the symptom of the situation is managed. And in a way, similar to Badiou's short book on ethics, he wants to say something like a reactionary version of the act would not be on the side of universal emancipation, because it would ultimately be unable to handle the core traumatic antagonism of the social field as such, and that a left-wing theory of the act is somehow capable of traversing it more adequately. However, in my view, I don't know that Žižek fully convinces me of the distinction between how the reactionary versus the left emancipatory truly relates to the act. I think this is an ethical point which we could discuss perhaps. The act names and elevates the disavowed core of the political situation and aims to traverse it. In a way, we could say in simple sense, it's a sublation of the traumatic kernel, but thought through a conception of the social that is deeply Lacanian. In other words, the social is built around, is constitutive of a repressed traumatic core. One practical example that I think makes sense at a collective level would be the way in which Occupy Wall Street identified the unnameable traumatic core of economic inequality in the American political discourse, elevated it as a signifier, and then that had a kind of pass onto the Sanders experience or movement. That would be one collective example of the act, which I think is quite interesting. At times, Žižek will say in capitalism, there is a traumatic core, which is a kind of quasi-transcendental core to the traumatic origin of the social, which is what he calls class struggle. But I would say that Žižek is not consistent about naming that traumatic core as class struggle, because he's working with an Althusserian thesis of the social, wherein class relations do not have an ontological primacy, but they are in fact contingent relations. The important point I want to draw out here is that Žižek relies on a conception of both the social and the ideological field that is deeply informed by by an Althusserian conception. Now, in his book on theories of ideology, the philosopher Jan Rehmann nicely illustrates the limitations of an Althusserian thesis or orientation to the social when he says that it does not allow us to identify what social and individual conditions and experiences lead to the readiness to voluntarily comply with the restrictions imposed on their own space of possibility. There is thus, in Rehmann's view, a quite fatalistic conception of subjectivity in which counter-subjectivity cannot be thought. It is rather subjectivity after an act wherein subjects are thrown into a new arrangement of the signifiers and the repetition of the death drive and imaginary misrecognition, etc., reemerges and repeats as a constitutive barrier to the possibility of counter-subjectivity. Subjectivity in this framework, thus, cannot take the next step, or at least the resources of Lacanian ideology theory do not immediately lend themselves to a thinking of ideology as what I would call a constructive process, wherein counterpower, or what I might call a subjective constructive process of counterpower, could be thought. This brings up what I consider a significant background problem within the field of post-Marxism, which I think that Žižek also recognizes, but which his theoretical commitments prevent him from truly attuning his thought towards. Thus, I think there is an ambivalence about what I am about to say in Žižek's work, but this ambivalence, which we could also call an obsessional aspect of his work, fascinates me. It is this ambivalence which I think leads to what I am calling his pragmatism, or his hyper-attentiveness to global current events, and the way in which he continuously modifies his positions accordingly. Now, to frame the limitations of post-Marxism, I want to draw on a work by Ellen Maskins Woods called The Retreat from Class, The New True Socialism, which was published in 1997. And it's a study of the way in which Western Marxism modified itself after the fall of the Soviet Union. In this book, Woods shows that post-Marxism arose based on the elimination of the centrality of the working class as the primary revolutionary agent, or even as the primary agent of social and political reforms. A common assumption of post-Marxism, or what Woods calls the new true theory of socialism, is that there is, quote, nothing in the logic of capitalism which determines the development of a united working class interest, apart from and prior to its ideological construction. Therefore, the centrality of discourse theory in the work of post-Marxism becomes a kind of stranglehold on the very notion of the primacy of class relations in capitalist social life. Post-Marxism is therefore marked and defined quite literally by the dissociation of politics from class and the establishment of what we call a non-correspondence between the economic sphere and the political sphere. This means that the post-Marxist turn dissolves the social, their theory of the social, into discourse. And in so doing, they replace the working class as the central agent of revolutionary change with a discursively constructed plural subject. Post-Marxism subordinates socialist struggle to a plurality of democratic struggles in which democracy arises as an indeterminate, abstract, and loosely defined end of any given political struggle. And we see this especially in Leclau and Move. For post-Marxists, and especially for the Althusserian school, Woods says, social reality is constituted by autonomous discourses, and all social identities are discursively negotiable. There is no subject interior to history. There is no human purpose or agency. Now, one way to understand post-Marxism is that it is a speculative and scholastic tendency that has existed within Marxism, not merely as a historical tendency that arose after the decline of the Soviet Union, but you could also read it as something that was a part of the Marxist and workers' movement, even going back to 1848. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx calls it true socialism. And he, to quote the Communist Manifesto, he says, when socialism ceases to express the struggle of one class against another, the true socialist, in quotes, feels conscious of representing not true requirements of working class liberation, but the requirements of truth, not the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of human nature and of man in general, who belong to no class, have no reality, who exist only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. That's a very interesting way of thinking about the relationship between post-Marxism and Marxism as such. I believe that Žižek must be read as a frustrated inheritor of post-Marxism. I say frustrated because while Žižek pragmatically attunes his political thought along these lines, which he was trained in, Althusserian Lacanianism, he's also not committed to its presuppositions. For example, in a recent exchange with the socialist American academic Vivek Chibber on Jacobin YouTube, whose work, Chibber's work, The Class Matrix, represents a return to the centrality of working class in Marxist analysis, it was striking, in my view, to see that Žižek's Lacanianism, which depends upon this notion of ideological imaginary misrecognition, the deadlocks of the real, etc., whereas Chibber believes that class interest can be thought in a kind of rational choice basis, Žižek had no disagreements with Chibber's position on the rational choice model of working class. That was very interesting to me and a sign of his pragmatism. So although post-Marxism is defined by its refusal to theorize the working class as the revolutionary agent, we should recognize that Žižek has developed several theories of the proletariat, what we might call substitutes for the proletariat, if he's not committed to the centrality of working class. One idea he's drawn to, but also torn on and ambivalent about, is the notion of what's called nomadic proletariat, a new global proletariat which emerges based on a zero-level antagonism, wherein across the world, there is a proletariat based on included part and excluded part. He's working both with Badiou and Rancière on this theory. he was drawn to it during the movement of the squares from 2010 to 2014, and framed the possibility even of a dictatorship of the proletariat from that position, which I found quite interesting. But when these movements fizzled out and we experienced the rise of right-wing populism, left-wing democratic socialism with Corbyn and Sanders, in a way, Žižek moved back to his own liberal, modest position when he ran as a politician in Slovenia. And even saying that Bernie Sanders' image at the inauguration of Joe Biden with the gloves in the wintertime was representative of the true Hegelian world spirit in his resigned repose, right? And that Sanders is the primary site of where political possibility resides globally. But nowhere in Žižek's thinking of the modern proletariat do we find a thinking of class that might be capable of fulfilling a core tenet of Marxist praxis, which is the abolition of class as such. If class is suppressed, but yet an identification of class cannot occur in the Althusserian theoretical universe that he works in, how could the working class or the proletariat get to a point for the abolition of class as such? Where is the dialectical process going to occur? This cannot be a speculative process. That seems limited. So again, it is this milieu, this theoretical milieu of Žižek's thought of post-Marxism that I think presents both an ambivalence, but also a kind of obsessional neurotic conundrum, which interests me quite a lot. Ellen Woods says in her brilliant polemic against post-Marxism, if not class interest, what other motive? If not class cohesion, working class cohesion, what other collective identity or principle of unity could necessitate the development of a working class perspective? Post-Marxism pragmatically experiments with substitutes for the proletariat and makes excuses for why they do not want to center the working class as a sunk feature of capitalist life. We could say, perhaps from the perspective of Lukács, the post-Marxist abandonment of the primacy of class is the adoption of what you might call a petty bourgeois standpoint, which is precisely the standpoint which has no standpoint. It's an orientation which would be a Marxism that is quite oxymoronic, perhaps. Now, although I think the theory of the act that Žižek develops is extremely important, I want to raise one limitation in my final concluding remarks. And that is that I think in Althusserian thought, there is a tendency to theorize subjectivity as an overwhelming structure of alienation, an overwhelming structure of imaginary misrecognition, that again goes back to the way that Althusser theorizes the social as such, as the unsocietal foundational structure of the individual. This is a process without history, right? A kind of theory of history without the subject, right? In this framework, ideology is not recognized in its own form as a praxis in the class struggle. Ideology only represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. What is the problem with this model? I think there is missing in it the dimension of lived experience in political struggle. There's also missing the standpoint of human praxis, which Žižek's ideology theory does not adequately arrive at. In Žižek's theory of ideology, the order of the signifier, the big other, and that of enjoyment, the thing as its embodiment, are radically heterogeneous, inconsistent. As soon as the field of the big other is penetrated by enjoyment, it becomes inconsistent, porous, perforated. And enjoyment is what cannot be symbolized. Its presence in the field of the signifier can only be detected through the holes and inconsistencies of this field. So the only possible signifier of enjoyment is the signifier of the lack in the other, the signifier of its own inconsistency. Now, within this framework, Žižek has developed an incredibly interesting way to think about political acts as aiming at opening up this inconsistent chasm, what he calls the abyssal gap that is opened by the cave void. What does the other want from me, right? But because Žižek does not theorize ideological forms as tied to class power and domination, as someone like Jan Rehmann, I think, has convincingly shown, he's not able to think what would come after the act. In other words, what might a counter identity, what might the question of solidarity be that would be beyond the shifting of signifiers and the relegation of subjectivity to the interminable real or the death drive of the social situation. Perhaps the Žižekian break from post-Marxism would have to come by a re-theorization of the political act with a newfound attentiveness to the way in which class power and formations structure ideology. Can the working class be thought as a counter-subjectivity at a collective level of political action in Žižek's framework? To think this would mean to make room for what Rehmann calls the lived experience of counterpower ideology from below. In other words, the proletariat would have to undergo a break from the stranglehold of its perverse attachments to the symptomatic core of the ideological system. But this is what I find missing in Žižek's framework. What happens after this release? How is a counterpower subjectivity, which is capable of rivaling the ideological power of the field, and sometimes that perverse stranglehold of the field of ideology, isn't even thought along, because of his post-Marxist commitments, a primary schism between proletariat and bourgeoisie, because the post-Marxist view has abandoned that more originary view of thinking about the ideological field as tied back to class interests and power. But again, Žižek is very ambivalent about class interests and power. He can talk to Chibber and express some interest in this. So can a Lacanian work with the notion of collective interests, right? If the unconscious is politics, are we always going to be duped back into some imaginary misrecognition and so on, right? That's a real question for me. I think Rehmann points to a reading of Gramsci as a way out of this conundrum and the construction of what he calls horizontal counterpower subjectivity that would not be beholden to a series of imaginary misrecognitions. And he gives the example of an interesting movement post-apartheid in South Africa, in which Indian and Black workers were accused by the bourgeoisie of having racial privilege. And instead, they identified with their status as working class people across the racial point. And it was that identification which disarmed or disabled the imposition of a disingenuous bourgeois racialization onto their own struggle and allowed them to actually forge a solidarity beyond the confines of the bourgeois ideology. That would be an example of something. But again, can a Lacanian theory of ideology think that as a positive constructive movement, right? That would be my question. An ideology critique that would focus on the common representations, the common sense of the people, and trust the dialectical process of a counter-identity process that could come from a point of struggle. But again, that would require that we theorize ideology back into class power and class interest, which post-Marxism is not willing to do. This is what I see as the missing element in Žižek's ideology theory, and I think that it is not too late to reintegrate it. Thank you very much.
Mark, do you want to take up the questions? I wonder. So let's
Yeah, I've got a question.
Oh, I think Ciara has one.
Oh, you go, Ciara.
Okay, thank you. I must admit, Daniel, I'm pretty hostile to post-Marxism, and I wrote a critique of Hart and Negley some years ago, sociological latent capitalism of late capitalism. No, it's not, it's something else. Postmodern left liberalism it's called, and critique their take on Deleuze and Guattari as well. But I think for me, the underlying problem, and it's a problem with Žižek perhaps as well, is abuses and misinterpretation of value theory in Marx. So I think there's a fundamental schism there. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good, fair point. I mean, in a way, post-Marxism that Žižek works with is not interested in the objective questions of capitalist value form. However, Žižek's break with Laclau and Althusser obviously comes in the very interesting way that he reinterprets commodity fetishism from the sublime objective ideology onward in ways which emphasize the subjective dimension, right? But also incorporate the objective contradictions of capitalism at the same time in very, very interesting ways, working off of Alfred Sun-Rettel's notion of real abstraction. So one could say that Žižek works with a highly sophisticated reading of Marx's Capital and unifies both the subjective and the objective mode of critique in his theory of, but I'm not really interested in that. I'm more interested in this talk in understanding how he theorizes class, proletariat, and solidarity, and why he has expressed this very interesting ambivalence to the legacy of post-Marxism, which wanted to say that capitalism in its post-Soviet, globalized, unicapitalist world order of neoliberalism, now thinks class as a contingent identity, right? And this actually is something that Žižek frequently says, which is working class identity should not be reduced to what he calls classism. And I agree with him. But the problem with that is that you need to make a prior decision on the primacy of class as such, because the culturalist turn, I think, makes an error about the way in which the primacy of class still can incorporate their interest in the plurality of identitarian struggles. You can still have both, in fact. So I think it's a kind of interesting debate that after the failure of Sanders is now able to come back into circulation. After the failure of both BLM and Sanders, we need to be having these kinds of conversations, and we need to push post-Marxism further than it's comfortable, further than it's willing to go, and not simply say, well, we can't say things like dictatorship of the proletariat because we're going to make liberals quite uncomfortable, right? Or orthodox Marxism and the labor theory of value is defunct, so don't even speak about it, and so on and so on. I think actually the tradition that Žižek works with, Rancière, Badiou, etc., is most interesting to me because there are Marxists that are interested in the question of subjectivity. They're not interested in the more scholastic solving of Marx's Capital and the unfinished, what Lyotard calls old man Marx, right? That infinite scholastic meditation. That's not the reversal of thesis 11 that Slavoj Zizek wants, right? His, because he's coming from psychoanalysis, is a subjective Marxism. But still, that subjective Marxism, I think, has a lot of shortcomings.
I think Matthew has a question, yeah?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Daniel. I really enjoyed your talk. I enjoyed all the talks, and I've tried to limit myself from intervening just to allow all of the speakers our own space to articulate our positions here. But Daniel, with your talk in particular, because I've had a very long interest in Slavoj's relationship with Laclau, the debates over class struggle versus populism and so forth. And I agree that there's some interesting ways that Slavoj has developed this distinction between thinking working class sociologically versus proletariat as a subjective position. And I think that even in the Althusserian tradition, there's a useful way that the deployment of class struggle methodologically within the context of scientific socialism is applied, I think, in interesting ways by Slavoj. But I'm wondering what you think about the role that communism has played, I guess, not just as a signifier, not just rhetorically, but as a way of trying to articulate methodologically some kind of dialectical and materialist position from which to think against the post-Soviet, post-Marxist position. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
And I'll just add. I mean, where I disagree with Slavoj, which will come out probably in what I'm going to say, is I personally don't think that communism has lasted as a productive signifier in this sense. So this is where I'm at odds with him. But I wonder what you think.
Well, I actually was trying to say, Matthew, that I don't think that he thinks it has either, because he's abandoned his Bajuian flirtation, which I think was pragmatically evidenced by the limitations of the movement of the squares. In other words, if you were going to have a kind of more thorough Hartenegriist continuation of anti-statist egalitarian possibility that was international in the theory of the multitudes, which I think Badiou and Žižek want to reverse that from a kind of Foucauldian or Deleuzian movementism into something that's going to be much more, maybe we could say, working with the rationalist tradition, working on a kind of an axiomatic form of communism, a form of communism which would be trying to reinterrogate the core idea of communism. I mean, it's always important to me to point out that in Badiou's theory of the idea of communism, he's also trying to say, as Marxists and communists, we need to rethink what is most essential of communism, right? And kind of go back to a different origin point in some ways. So I think that in Žižek's highly pragmatic, slightly erratic way of thinking about politics, I don't think that he actually has much fidelity to that anymore. And I kind of agree with him on that, to be honest. I think that, but nonetheless, I'm also going to admit my own ambivalence about to what extent the idea of communism can be resurrected today as a, although at the same time, I will also express my concern regarding his trust in the process of the progressive liberal Democratic Party as the kind of engine of progressive reforms, right? I really see that structure as a deeply flawed, terminally flawed, and they work on a cynicism which is infinite, and they, in my view, should not be trusted at all. So yes, I think you're right, and I'll stop there. But this is a great question.
I could interject a little bit more, but I'm gonna just.
Yeah, I know Andrew has a comment. I can allow Andrew to talk. You're permitted to talk, Andrew.
Okay, super. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just I just had a thought. I was looking at the most recent book, and I was a little flummoxed, I must say, to see how much he emphasizes. And I hadn't recalled that he made this emphasis so strongly as he does in his most recent book about how he wants to work with Marxism in a way that is distinct from what he's calling reductionist, precisely in what's associated with the objective, let's call it orientation or tradition, that I would call that sort of the sociological dimension, or you'll find it in capital volumes. You find it in Marx's capital volumes. You find it in certainly in other traditions in Marxism, that there is whether we want to be ironic about it, but a certain, I don't remember as Badiou put it like this, but a new science that was developed with Marx, that we do have to say it combines certain elements of sociology, of empiricism, of with a more German idealist theorizing. So that he's so clearly currently, and I guess that's always been his tradition, to mark a strict difference. I'm wondering if you thought, because it occurred to me that that might be a bit of an Achilles heel in his work, this need to absolutely repudiate quote unquote objectivism in Marxism. Because I think if we do that, then how do we discuss hegemonic forms? How do we discuss structural forces that are, that are happening? Are we not then sort of just immersed in a very hysteric or obsessional or paranoid or et cetera immediacy of the moment where we're just twisting and turning with every new change as that's happening. So there's no greater logic of how we were going to analyze the circumstances in which we're facing, and how to then address that in regards to the primacy, which is important for Marxists, of working class experience. I'm just wondering if you had a comment on that.
Yeah. Great question. I mean, this hits the heart of my conundrum, which is, can Lacanian theory address the lived experience of collective solidarity? And I'm not sure that it totally can. I think that, in fact, it needs to be supplemented in some sense, because, again, in my years of study, my contention remains that there is a pessimistic fatalism based on some of the presuppositions of how the social is even theorized to begin with, how the subject is even theorized to begin with, right? Which I don't think are borne out by true empirical examples of like how people organize, right? So I think one would have to create an empirical political anthropology of counter examples that goes against the fatalism of Lacanianism in some sense, if you want to convince them that working class interest can re-emerge as the centrality of what we commit ourselves to. Because the post-Marxists reject that, right? And they reject it, I think, and Woods is right, even though her polemic is extremely robust and very strong, maybe too strong as a polemic. Everyone should read her text there. It's kind of prophetic, especially in a post-Sanders world in which everyone is recognizing that it is class, which is this primary constitutive antagonism, but no one allowed us to think it before. Now we have to open up and think what we can do with it. So for me, that's the question, is sort of what can Lacanianism, how can we supplement it? And I'm not quite honestly there yet to really go that next step, but that's something I intend to do. It's really my intention was more to provocatively throw some problems down. Okay, so there's that. Let me have Vakhtang. Vako, you're free to go. This will be our last question, but then we'll go to Matthew.
Oh, okay. I don't know why the camera is not on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a question, also maybe answer Andrew and say, that there is such thing as non-all, which is, again, presence and absence of objectivity, and both positive presence of an object as well as negative absence of subject. So I don't see non-all, I don't see Lacan's anti-empiricism as nihilism. Žižek would say that would be propaganda by the class enemy, or something like that. I mean, I don't know, if we are not going to uphold paradoxality of dialectic and its radical incompleteness as a materialist way forward, then yes, I mean, that's pretty much a dead end, because then we either resign ourselves to relativism or we go back to absolutism. So I think that we should not be pessimistic, because this is totally an opening into working class interest as people who don't exactly have their interest fully formulated, because they don't have that access to have a voice to do so, and it's in making of an outplace into a splace, and that is the non-all, the dialectic between the center and the periphery. So
yeah, I think that's helpful, Vako. I mean, I guess one thing I always return to is Lacan's point in Seminar 17 against or criticizing the Weltanschauung, the worldview. And I've been interested in trying to make a synthesis of Lukács and Lacan, because Lukács is a thinker of the necessity of a working class Weltanschauung. If you don't have a working class standpoint or worldview, there's no Marxism to speak of. in that sense. And I've become more and more drawn to this presupposition. And I think Lacan is a great challenger to that notion in some sense. So I'm not saying abandon Lacan, I'm saying what are the true limitations there and what does it mean? But I want to stop and recognize that we have one more presenter, and thank you all for listening to my talk. Matthew, are you ready to go? You're muted.
I'm ready to go if
Awesome.
That's where we're going. Okay.
Let me introduce you.
Sure.
Give me 1 second here. So we're very, very pleased to welcome Matthew Flisfeder with us. Matthew is a great scholar of Marxist thought, of Lacanian theory, of postmodern theory. He's associate professor of rhetoric and communications at University of Winnipeg in Canada. Has been a close kind of sparring partner, but also collaborator, I guess you could say, with Žižek himself. Has done, was actually, I want to say that Matthew was deeply involved with the Peterson-Žižek debate, which was a globally massively interesting and important event. And he is the author of Postmodern Theory and Blade Runner, as well as a very interesting book with the Diaresis series called Algorithmic Desire, which is on basically a Lacanian theory of social media. I think it's fair to say. And the title of Matthew's talk today is On Žižek's Inhuman Humanism. Welcome.
All right. Thanks very much for that intro, Daniel. Thanks to you and thanks to Dwayne for organizing the event. Thanks for all of the other speakers and your talks. Again, if I didn't respond at the time, it's not out of disinterest. I'm very much interested in the various perspectives that are being brought here today. I want to give everybody their own space to speak and articulate their positions. So what I want to do right now is I have a kind of a long-ish, I guess, introductory statement here that's really meant to position myself with the second half of my talk, which is going to be in a way how I respond to a kind of a provocation from Žižek in his latest book, taking on my more recent turn to a kind of a focus on a dialectical humanism. Okay, so I'll begin. This is just an introductory remark to situate myself. Okay, so today, the popular concept of the Anthropocene, used to denote the human geological age, puts to question the centrality of human subjectivity. Critical post-humanism, particularly in its neo-Spinozan, Deleuzian ontological realist versions tied to immediacy and pure immanence, this demands the decentering of the human subject, which, in its hubristic and Promethean disregard for the non-human, appears to have set the world on fire, causing irreparable environmental damage. But is an active decentering of the human subject truly possible? What if the only way for us to properly assess the situation is by doing the opposite, of actually occupying an anthropocentric position, not in the sense of human domination of the non-human world, but one of making human subjectivity the methodological and ethical center of our investigation of this conundrum? What if the age of the Anthropocene demands not the decentering of the human subject, but the reverse? What if it is because of the Anthropocene that we must now aim to rethink a dialectical and universalist humanism? What if in this case, in other words, is that the human subject is the proletariat, not of the Anthropocene, but of the Capitalocene? For instance, as Frederick Jameson has put it, the fact of the Anthropocene proves that humanity can truly change the world, but now it would be wise to terraform it. In precisely the same way that the proletariat is the symptom of the capitalist economy, the human subject is now the symptom of the Capitalocene in the sense that the capitalist ecology is always already post-human. By this, I mean that the reifying forces of capitalism are always in the process of undermining human necessity, making human merely instrumental in the generation of profit. Even and especially that is when we consider the fact that the subject of bourgeois society is reified in its ownership of private property. Objective property becomes a stand-in for human subjectivity, which it trades on the market, or human labor congealed in productive technology, an idea that autonomous Marxists developed in their reading of Marx's general intellect in the Grundrisse, Verno, and so on. This way of perceiving a post-human capitalism is no less the case for the working class, conceived as owners of their own private property in the form of commodified labor power. The key difference between capitalism and slavery, you might say, is the fact that the worker is the owner of their own labor, which they sell rather than having themselves sold as productive property. Yet we might concede that the now popular turn to post-humanist critical theory has emerged at the precise historical moment when the middle classes, through neoliberal market fundamentalism and its transformation of subjects into forms of quote-unquote human capital, find themselves increasingly reified in the entirety of their everyday lives. That is to say that human capital is the product of the dissolution of the barrier between the subject owner of labor power and its own self, conceived in terms of a commodity object. Now, all of life is or has been commodified and is in this peculiar historical moment when the proponents of post-humanism aim not to humanize the exploited and oppressed, but to downgrade humanity the more we are all reified by the capitalist system. How can the decentering of the human subject in this way be anything but a victory for the post-human term in capitalism? When in his discussion of commodity fetishism, Marx asserts that capitalist society is premised on the social relation between things, he provides for us the matrix for understanding capitalism as a post-human structure of the market as the blind, asubjective and objective regulatory force. What we call post-modernity is the moment when there is no part of the world that is not potentially commodifiable. Everything becomes reified as commodity, where previously it was assumed that some human quality is capable of escape. In this situation, humanity becomes the symptom of the post-humanist capitalist ecology. The human subject now occupies and overlaps with the same position as the hysterical subject or the feminine position of the non-all, as in Lacan's logics of situation. If it is true that the hysteric, we might say, is Freud's proletariat, expressive of the non-all of the phallic social order, then perhaps we can grasp the human subject in the same way as the expression of the non-all of post-human capitalism. Human, as Ray Brassier has put it, for instance, names the absolute negativity, an absent center, against which is posited an affirmative limit constitutive of the metaphysical totality. This is the sense in which I want to develop my own rethinking of a dialectical humanism appropriate for the age of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene discourse calls not for the decentering of the human subject, but instead a rethinking of dialectical humanism. The dilemma, however, with this conception is the fact that from the perspective of historical materialism and psychoanalysis, subject is constitutively and not merely contingently decentered and self-alienated. This is a point worth noting against both the post-humanist aim to decenter the human subject, as well as against the older tradition of Western Marxist humanism, which aimed towards a politics of disalienation. Althusser, for instance, has noted, in fact, that the significance of Marx and Freud, against the common Freudo-Marxist attempt to blend their methodologies, lies in the different ways each, Marx and Freud, troubled the bourgeois liberal conception of human subjectivity. Marx, on the one hand, challenged the liberal conception of the subject as free, independent, and autonomous individual by showing that the class struggle, as opposed to the individual man, in Althusser's terms, is the motor of history. Freud, on the other hand, challenged the conception of the human subject as fully self-aware, self-present, and completely egoistic and rational. Through the discovery of the unconscious, Freud demonstrated that the individual subject is driven not necessarily by a rational ego, but also by its response to repressed, irrational, and unconscious wishes, desires, drives, to which the subject remains unaware at an individual level, often repeating painful experiences that seem to otherwise contradict the goals it sets forth rationally to serve its own interests. To put the point more directly, according to Althusser, Marx and Freud both prove that the subject is constitutively decentered and self-alienated, a point that poses a problem for contemporary critical theories focused on projects of decentering. If the subject is constitutively decentered, then what exactly is the usefulness of a politics aimed at radical decentering? What is the purpose of an emancipatory ethics aimed aimed to decenter the subject when the subject is already constitutively decentered, castrated, and self-alienated. As an emancipatory strategy, Anthropocene appears to propose a reduction in human activity and retreat into the small. It asks for humanity to wither back into flat existence, evening out in horizontal fashion with all other species living on planet Earth. Anthropocene theory speaks to what Alain Badiou has called an animal humanism, where humanity is perceived as a pitiable animal and deserves only to disappear. These are quotes from Badiou. Animal post-humanism, I'm calling it, and Anthropocene discourse emerge out of a politics of guilt, seeking to mend the wound that humanist and anthropocentric politics and culture have cut open in the natural world. It's in this sense that the post-humanist ethics of proponents of the Anthropocene discourse aim to decenter the human subject. But as Althusser has pointed out, the subject is always already decentered. If this is truly the case, then even Althusser's own critique of socialist humanism as ideological remains, in my view, somewhat misguided as a strategy of emancipatory thinking as well as a form of emancipatory science. While it may perhaps be true that history is a process without a subject or goal, it is very difficult to imagine an emancipatory strategy that does not develop out of at least some conception of a historically relative and contingent premise, relative, that is, to the particularity of the material and historical conjuncture, and examined, evaluated, and enacted by collective subject. Althusser's position, then, is puzzling to me, insofar as it is difficult to understand the emergence of scientific socialism without having it grounded in an engaged subjective position within the class struggle. It is not by way of objective neutral knowledge that scientific socialism examines its object, history, but from a singular position occupied within the class struggle, not the spontaneous worldview of the working class, as the young Lukács, for instance, contends, but that of a particular political and philosophical position relative to the material conditions of existence. Historical materialism and psychoanalysis, we must recall, are unlike other sciences in that they are forms of praxis, the combination of theory and practice, in which the knowledge produced on the part of its subject has the implicit effect of simultaneously changing its object. The subject cannot, it is true, perceive itself on its own in this way, and it requires arresting, grasping, and mediation from the position of some external negative vantage point, maybe the party, maybe the analyst, I don't know. Nevertheless, any emancipatory ethics requires building not towards the decentering of an already decentered and self-alienated or castrated subject, neither can it be built on a politics of disalienation and the fantasy of an uncastrated enjoyment. Fantasies of substantialization of nature, of the other, merely disavow the negativity that stands at the heart of existence, and by doing so, have the potential to fall into forms of oppression. There is nothing more violent than forcing the other to substantialize in the way that it is fantasized. Instead, emancipatory politics requires political, methodological, and ethical centering, something of which we get in the political form of the party or even in the formal relation of psychoanalysis, whereas the element of something of the form of the transference or the social link that moves the subject towards reasoning, but never in the individual subject alone or on its own. This, after all, is the mistake made by the subject conceived by bourgeois humanism. Analysis centers the unconscious or even the class struggle as the negative constitutive of the structure as an absent cause. Can we then defend a form of political centrism in this way? I believe this to be the case, and I do so here with the aim of renewing a universalist and dialectical humanism that contrasts with the theoretically fraught project of Western Marxist humanisms of the 20th century, which aimed at an ethics of disalienation. Okay, so finally, thank you for bearing with me with my long introduction. I'll try not to be too much longer. Okay, so in response to my position, Žižek has argued that my humanism preserves the human while rejecting the subject. And I want to say he's incorrect. What I defend is not the human against the subject, but rather a conception of the subject that is drawn from a dialectical and perhaps controversial defense of anthropocentrism. This is not an attempt to pit philosophical anthropology against ontology, though. My position emerges out of contemporary post-humanist critiques of anthropocentrism in the context of the Anthropocene. So I want to kind of switch gears now and discuss Žižek a little bit more pointedly, because oddly enough, and maybe I'm curious to know how people feel about this, my turn to or rethinking of a dialectical and universal humanism draws quite substantially on what I think of as Žižek's inhuman humanism. So although he's likely to disagree with me, I want to make the claim that Žižek's anti-humanist modernism, in fact, and within the context of contemporary debates over anthropocentrism, accomplishes a humanist gesture and helps us to rethink and revive the concept of humanism for the era of post-human capitalism. Žižek's response to contemporary post-humanism has been twofold. It has been inspired by his Hegelian reinterpretation of dialectical materialism, but it has also pushed him to be more persuasively define human subjectivity methodologically, as well as a universalist ethics in a way that encourages us to repeat the kind of humanism that has its foundations in modernist conceptions of freedom, truth, and universality. However, this repetition, to be sure, is a far cry from both bourgeois liberal and older Marxist humanist and existentialist defenses of human freedom and universality. Žižek's humanism is grounded less in the pursuit of the absolute than in the acknowledgement that truth remains actual only through the failed absolute, that is, in the failure of its actualization and its betrayal. And this failure of actualization of the absolute is the place where the position of the subject is inscribed in the picture. Žižek's humanism, as I'm calling it, goes missing in much of the discourse around his work and his ties to the Enlightenment tradition, his atheist or Hegelian reading of Christianity, and his ongoing questioning of modern humanisms in both their liberal and socialist varieties. Implied in this, I claim, we find the seeds for the potential to reinvent a radical, universal, and dialectical humanism appropriate for coming to grasp the contradictions of a looming post-human capitalism in the 21st century. While Žižek often speaks of the inhuman core of human subjectivity, with attention to the death drive, for instance, I propose instead that his own groundwork in an Enlightenment and modernist tradition, read through German idealism and even the anti-humanism of Althusser and Lacan, helps us to develop what I call a humanism of the not all. My claim, of course, appears counterintuitive, since not only does Žižek consistently attack and challenge socialist humanisms, i.e. Stalinism with a human face, as well as liberal humanisms and postures of human rights, but he also writes out of the Lacanian and Althusserian anti-humanist traditions. Against those who, like Althusser, claim Hegel has a humanist influence on Lukács, Lefebvre, Sartre, for instance, the Marxist humanism of the 20th century, Žižek has been quick to assert that Hegel is not a humanist, and has used his Lacanian reading of Hegel to develop an anti-humanist theory of the inhuman core of human subjectivity. Nevertheless, much of his writing continues to be premised on answering the question, what is the human subject? And I think what is the human subject in somewhat of a, not necessarily moralistic, but ethical framework in terms of what is to be done, who can do it. This is a question that in some ways flies in the face of the anti-humanism of Althusser and Foucault, in their own ways, both declaring the end of the subject and seeing the subject as a mere byproduct or epiphenomenon of ideology and discourse. But much more recently, especially in his writing about the various new materialisms and post-humanisms of the 21st century, Žižek encourages a rereading of Enlightenment thought and German idealism through the lens of anti-humanism, as well as through a post-Cold War communist critique of global capitalism. For him, the only way to resuscitate the Marxist goal of communism is via a turn back to Hegel. It's through his return to Hegel that I find Žižek's writing, the potential to rethink the terms of a humanist critical theory for the 21st century. It's against the post-humanists, and especially with his much sharper and clearer turn toward Hegel in books like Less Than Nothing and Absolute Recoil, the reinvention of dialectical materialism, beginning with the parallax view, and his return to the Cartesian cogito in Ticklish Subject, that we see not a return to humanism, as he often likes to claim about his writing on Lenin. Rather, what we find here is a line of questioning that forces us to repeat core humanist thinking, not merely to answer the question, what is the meaning of humanity? Such a boring question is far less important than those that pertain to the survival of humanity and human ethics in the face of looming ecological catastrophe, the rise of digital automation, artificial intelligence, or the technological singularity. Here, Žižek's inhuman humanism pushes us to ask much more relevant ethical questions about our survival and how we need to think our agency in non-moralistic terms and against the kinds of moralizing we might find in other varieties of liberal consequentialist thought or in the virtue ethics of identity politics liberalism. As he puts it in Hegel and a Wired Brain, this is a quote, "One often hears that in order to confront appropriately the threat of an ecological catastrophe, we have to renounce anthropocentrism and to conceive of ourselves, humanity, as subordinated element in the great chain of being." That's the end of the quote. He goes on to note that the post-humanist claim that we, humanity, are posing a threat to Mother Earth. Yet it is not Earth that we need to be worried about. Here's another quote. "We are in trouble. Earth is indifferent. It has survived much worse disasters than the possible self-destruction of one of its species. What is under threat is our environment, our habitat, the only one in which we can live. From the imagined standpoint of Earth, it would be much better for its global ecosystem if we, humanity, disappeared. So what is under threat is, in ecological crisis, is our survival, the survival of our society." End of quote. Here he points out, we find the hidden anthropocentrism of post-humanist anti-anthropocentrism. And I would add that it's here, in his criticism of the performative contradiction of the post-humanists, that we can also locate Žižek's own repetition of the foundational humanist gesture of showing how it is we humans who make history. By tackling ambiguities of biogenetics and cognitive sciences, as well as the anti-anthropocentric theories and concerns of the new materialists and post-humanists, amid rising uncertainties of humanity in the face of an environmental and ecological catastrophe, and the rise of new digital media, automation, AI, and the forecasted singularity, we find in Žižek encouragement for repeating the modernist intrigue with the figure of the human and the human subject at precisely the moment when everywhere we hear about its untimely death. In large part, the repetition of the question of the human subject is forced by a demand to consider ethical questions about our political conjuncture, as in the old Leninist, what is to be done. But here it is worth noting a semantic distinction between terms like human, subject, and humanism, which tie back into some of the deficiencies of the Marxist and socialist humanisms of the 20th century, particularly those that base themselves on the early marks of the 1844 manuscripts. So, to put it bluntly, the difficulty with a Marxist humanism that draws on some conception of total man, as Lefebvre puts it, for instance, is that it assumes a completed and self-reconciled conception of humanity with itself or with its own nature. That is, it is a dream of achieving a reconciled balance with nature, and not just with nature. I mean, even in the late Marcuse, for instance, we see where there's a kind of a technological accelerationism that suggests that if we can eliminate the reality principle in favor of the pleasure principle, then through technology, there's some kind of reconciliation that can be achievable. And this is a point that I disagree with. Ironically, we find the same hope here of a balanced nature in much of the discourse of a post-humanist materialist and realist, which see the birth of human subjectivity and reason as something akin to an ontological deviation from nature and from reality. This is similar to the rise of the biopolitical scientisms of the early Soviet period in the projects of biocosmism and technosis, as Žižek often calls it, from which, according to him, we see the rise of the kind of Stalinist romantic humanism that formed as a reactionary position against the failures of Soviet new materialists. But it was also this turn that caused, according to Althusser, the Stalinist deviation away from the Marxist science of historical materialism and toward the tripartite flaws of economism, historicism, and humanism. Part of Žižek's fear, though, about the growth of new post-humanist movements is that they potentially raise the specter of a much more brutal reactionary humanism. However, and in contrast with many of the left post-humanist movements, Žižek shows too that the post-human turn also signals a change or a transformation in the capitalist mode of production. He shows that in order to save itself, capitalism must become post-human. Post-humanism, then, in its different guises, works either as an underlying defense of this new stage in capitalist production at the same time that it advocates inaction and unreason on the part of human subjects it opposes. So I'm getting close. I know I'm going close to time, but I'm on my last couple of paragraphs. Okay. Unlike Althusser, who saw in Stalin's humanism a deviation from Marxist science, Sartre, for instance, was one who turned toward a humanist reading of historical materialism precisely against the anti-humanism of Stalinism. And in fact, much of the debate that has followed in subsequent decades rests on the question of whether or not Stalinism is a humanism. The trouble with Sartre, though, as Žižek notes, and I agree, is that his humanism expresses too much of a voluntarism that dismisses the structural aspects of ideology that Althusser so significantly drew out in his theories of ideology and subjectivity. But as an entry point for how I conceive Žižek's inhuman humanism, or a humanism of the not all, or perhaps more appropriately, a repetition of the humanist gesture, based on Žižek's return to the cogito, dialectic, and the subject of modernity, that is for how I conceive Žižek's inhuman humanism, a humanism of the not all. Althusser's theory of subjectivity offers a first point for articulating Žižek's strategy for thinking the human subject, and the way this is tied to his return to the Enlightenment and modernist theories of German idealism, especially Kant and Hegel, against, for instance, the Spinoza of Althusser and contemporary posthumanists. One key is expressed through Žižek's conception of disparity, which refers to the way that he redefines the being of being human as alienated or as incomplete. The failure to be what one is, he writes, is constitutive of being human. This is a failure that triggers human creativity and reasoning, or as he puts it elsewhere, deficiency is a core feature of being human. In this way, there can be no inhumanism without the betrayal of humanism, that is, without the prior positing of the humanist subject, so that through the process of reasoning, the inhuman subject becomes capable of presupposing the positing of its foundational humanist gesture. It's only from the perspective of our inhumanity that the universality of humanism is even comprehensible. Or yet another way to make this point is the claim, as Žižek endlessly repeats, that the subject is precisely the failure of its own actualization. Therefore, there is no inhuman subject without humanism, or in other words, the ethical subject only emerges through the creative failure of the humanist subject to realize itself. Its universality is perceived only in its betrayal, and this betrayal, I claim, is the humanist subject. So Žižek therefore accomplishes a rethinking of humanism, I claim, despite himself, on the grounds of alienation and negativity, as opposed to a humanist Marxist conception of unalienated or disalienated species being fully reconciled toward itself. And it's via his psychoanalytic reading of Hegel and German idealism that we find the distinction between the latter, which sees alienation as contingent, and a view of alienation as constitutive both of subjectivity as well as reality itself. Put differently, if reality is ontologically complete, that leaves human subjects impotent, having no true ability to impact upon the real. But we are told that we have produced an Anthropocene in which too much of the world has been impacted, changed, and transformed by the human footprint. If, however, we acknowledge the incompleteness of ontological reality, we may grasp the human subject as the very place of this ontological gap in the parallax of reality. This positions alienated human subjects as ethical agents, with the ability to either destroy or take care of the world. Ontological incompleteness gives us the sense in which human ethical action is made capable of materially transforming the world for better or worse, and it is the modernist universalist ethic that drives us forward, in contrast with the postmodernist anti-universalist ethic that sees only the end of history and dystopia as the folding back into the present, the perpetual present, that cautions us only to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway has put it. Against such a post-humanist perspective that sees the human subject as the culprit of planetary demise, we see how Žižek's humanism of the not all, his inhuman humanism, provides the model for seeing through towards the salvation of humanity as the reaching of its own notion of the modernist project of universal emancipation. So to conclude, in Žižek's own terms, I claim that what we require today is not the decentering of the human, but a superanthropocentrism. As Žižek puts it, and this is a quote, "What is required from us in this moment is paradoxically a kind of superanthropocentrism. We should control nature, control our environment. We should allow for a reciprocal relationship to exist between the countryside and cities. We should use technology to stop desertification or the polluting of the seas. We are once again responsible for what is happening, and so we are also the solution." That's the end of quote. As he explains elsewhere too, another quote, If we have to care also about the life of water and air, it means precisely that we are what Marx called universal beings, as it were, able to step outside ourselves, stand on our own shoulders, and perceive ourselves as a minor moment in the natural totality. To escape into the comfortable modesty of our finitude and mortality is not an option. It is a false exit to catastrophe, end quote. This is the position that I too defend. But unlike the projects of both Western Marxist humanists and today's post-humanists, our theoretical and political core cannot be a politics of disalienation, but rather to grasp the fact that alienation is a constitutive dimension of subjectivity, a position we can only grasp by setting out from a conception of a social humanity split by antagonism. Thanks for bearing with me. I know that was long. I'm done.
Bravo, Matthew. That was fabulous. That was.
Really I should mention quickly too. So this was sort of a composite of two forthcoming papers. The beginning is from an invited piece that I hope will be in Problemi International, and the second half is a chapter in a forthcoming book edited by Zahi Zalua, Understanding Žižek, Understanding Modernism.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I have many comments and questions myself, but I'm not going to hog the floor like that. So I want to turn it over to other panelists that are with us. Dwayne, Mark, feel free to jump in. Graham is here as well. And by the way, Graham Harmon had a slight scheduling mishap, but we're going to have him go first thing tomorrow because Nadia Bouali cannot make it. So Graham, we'll have you go at noon Eastern tomorrow. So
I just wanted to say I thought it was a great paper, and yeah, I think that what's called the concept. I've always been averse to the concept of centrism, but you use the term political centrism in a way that I can now say, yeah, I could be a political centrist. It was excellent. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, Matthew, I wanted to ask you what you think about Marx's later development of the category of what he calls the social individual, which comes up in his reflections on post-industrial capitalism in the Grundrisse. And this kind of refers to this socialization of the proletariat under conditions of increasing displacement from productive labor. Financialized capitalism is kind of a part of that. So it's a way of Marx connecting to what the proletarian working class subjectivity is under neoliberalism. It's this kind of socialized, fragmented, and do you find that offers a kind of different way of thinking about Marxist humanism that we got from C.L.R. James and Lukács and the big classic figures of Western Marxism? And do you think that a new theory of Marxist humanism is necessary also because the mode of production under neoliberal capitalism has so radically altered and fragmented the working class subjectivity? Does that feed into a necessity to re-theorize Marxist humanism for you? Does it come down to that kind of political economy mutation of our present?
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Those are great questions, and there's a lot to unpack in there. I guess the first thing that I would say is that one of the difficulties that I have with the tradition of Marxist humanism is the way that it tries so hard to draw on the 1844 manuscripts, the whole, the theory of species being, and even, Marx's early critique of Hegel via Feuerbach. But what I take in my reading, I guess, is that when I see, and this comes up in some ways as the more and more I see post-humanists or new materialist Marxists, Thomas Nail is a good example, or even non-Marxist thinkers going back to the early Marx in defense of an anti-Anthropocene politics like Judith Butler, for instance, is you can kind of see that there's a sort of, not what I would call a humanism, but a sort of a naturalism that comes out in Marx's appropriation of Feuerbach's materialism. And I think that if we look at the later Marx, there's still a turn back to Hegel, but it's a Hegel that's read more via his rethinking of the science of logic. And even in Capital, for instance, I think that one of the difficulties for me is to think of Capital, it's often regarded as Marx's, as a political economy. But I think that, I'm not saying anything original here, but I think that it's useful to rethink it more as a critique of political economy, not a critique of political economy, but political economy read as bourgeois ideology. So what we get in Capital is more, as I read it, more an ideology critique, a materialist ideology critique of bourgeois ideology. So what Marx is trying to show in Capital is that if you take bourgeois humanism at its word and see it to its limit, that in material terms, what you end up with is not a humanization of the people, but a dejection of the people. So when we take the term proletariat, for instance, and I think you get this sense of proletariat more so in Engels's original draft of the Communist Manifesto, is the way that proletariat is the working class that's specific to capitalism, which gives it its historical specificity. But what makes it specific to capitalism is the way that I wouldn't say human labor power, but wage labor. Wage labor is incorporated into production within capitalism, only to then devalue and deject the human labor that has been commodified through the wage form. So that what we see in something like neoliberalism, for instance, as I read it, is a continuation of that process. And we have that short period, the post-war to the 70s, post-war to, so the social welfare state period where you have a slowing down of that process. But then neoliberalism becomes a new form of hypercapitalism, where through not just the commodification of wage labor, but through the total commodification of all of human existence, right? So that in neoliberalism, when we're treating ourselves as human capital, every activity that we do is an investment in our objectified self, only to then, to incorporate it, but then only to be pushed out and dejected. And I would argue in this way, dehumanized. Right. So that if we begin from the position of thinking about the individual in relation to the society, we have a sense of a humanism that begins from a kind of a social humanity, even in the way that Marx in Thesis 10 says that the position of the old materialism, as he puts in Thesis 10 on Feuerbach, is civil society. Right, so that we think about the old materialism as a materialism of civil society, the market society, and so on. Whereas the position of the new materialism, dialectical materialism, he wouldn't call it that, but later it's called this. The position of dialectical materialism is to begin from the position of thinking the individual relative to the society as such. So that the way that I want to think about humanism here draws on that idea, Marx's development in Capital of how the capitalist mode of production is in fact undermining of this sense of humanism, that if we think about the betrayal of that sense of humanism from the beginning with the position of the social, then I think that we have a sense of a dialectical and universal humanism that I think is even still drawn out in what Slavoj is trying to do, not necessarily with a challenge to capitalism, value form, and so on, but thinking about more so the contradictions present within the predominantly still, I think, liberal ideology. I still would argue that we're still living in a conditions where liberalism is predominant and all of the various other formations are reactionary to the centrality of a liberal political philosophy and capitalism as the economic byproduct of that system. I hope that makes sense. You asked a loaded question.
Yeah, no, it's really good. Reminds me of, even though I don't support them, the far left manifesto of Tikkun, when they say that the closest humanism we have is the humanism of human capital. Everything is about maximization of one's own purview of human capital. And that's definitely true, because for someone like Lukács, there is an outside to reified social existence, and it's a communist, something like a communist state, right? And
The
That
problem I
kind
have,
of-
I just want to say though, the problem that I have with somebody like Lukács, especially the early Lukács, and I'm a big admirer of Lukács's work. You know, and I know that you did the conference on destruction of reason, which I think is a brilliant work. But the problem I have with your Lukács is that I think that he puts far too much, and I think this is typical of the majority of left critical theory today. And I'd like to distinguish between a left view, which I see as largely a populist orientation, versus projects that are specific, like a socialist project with a definite aim and goal, as opposed to the infinitely demanding of Simon Critchley. But I think that with Lukács, there's too much that's being placed on the proletariat, that there's such a strong demand. The proletariat will definitely wake up from its slumber as being, the only thinking commodity in the system. And I think that there's an element of substantialization of the proletariat in this process that turns into a form of violence under Stalinism. Right.
Yeah, you're right. But Engels set it up as well, because when you look at Engels in his later years, when he revisits the night, because the thesis on Feuerbach of Thesis 11 and all of that was written when Marx and Engels were basically kids. And Engels writes a later text called Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, where he revisits his youthful, intuitive idea against Feuerbach and says, we were right. And then he further says that the workers' movement absorbed what was left of bourgeois philosophy, the heart of Hegelian philosophy, into its own culture, its own milieu, right? I always found that a beautiful point. It's one of Lukács's most favorite references, that point of Engels. And of course, you're right about Lukács doing that with proletariat. I think today the question is, we need a bit of that, but not so over the top as, because we have hardly any of that today. So
what I like about that text, the text on Feuerbach from the later Engels, and this is not a profound point, but I like the way that this classic distinction between idealism and materialism that he emphasizes in the old dialectic and the new dialectic, I think comes back very strongly in the way that, and I've written about this, and this is a central aspect of my rethinking of humanism, especially through the way that Žižek reads the Lacanian logics of sexuation, is that before he gets into the logics of sexuation, he rethinks the cogito in the way that for him, Lacan splits the I think and the I am, right? The I think, the idealism, the I am of being, and the way that Lacan does it in two different ways in Seminar 11, Seminar 14. So on the four fundamental concepts and on the logic of fantasy. And I forget which comes first in Lacan, if the initial choice is being and you lose thinking, or if the initial choice is thinking, you lose being. But the way that Žižek does it is to say that both stand, and that there's a different way of thinking, the choice of being versus the choice of thought or reasoning. And he assigns these positions in the logic of sexuation, so that the choice of being he codes as masculine, and then thinking is relegated to the position of the unconscious. Whereas in the choice of thinking, he locates that in the feminine ethical position, where you take thinking all the way to the end. And in the process of reasoning all the way to the end, you end up accomplishing a materialist gesture of thought cannot go any further, it must act. This is how I think that the thesis, when Žižek says rethink Marx's thesis of 11, not act but think, is that the only way to act in an ethical way is to take thinking all the way to the end point. And this is why I think when Kopček, for instance, says that the ethical act is feminine, this is one way that I think we can read this, right? I think this is one way we can think it. And I think it's also how we can dispel with this ongoing dispute between idealism and materialism. I think this phrase from Frederick Jameson, I know this phrase from Frederick Jameson, that it's preferable not to think the debate between idealism and materialism, but how the debate itself is a product of contradiction within the material conditions in which we're existing as such. And Karl Korsch, takes up this, in different ways. I'm probably just going off on a tangent.
No, it's brilliant.
You're talking about.
I really think it's brilliant. I want to invite one more question before we close for the day. This has been incredible, Matthew. Let's see here. I know that we have YouTube as well. I know that also, yes, you're getting some claps on YouTube. People are showing you love. I thought that was a brilliant intervention, and I think that it's fascinating that thesis 11 has come up multiple times, and of course Todd McGowan's talk is going to be about that tomorrow, which we're
my retort to Todd is that forget thesis 11, go to thesis 10. I know that Balabar and the Althusserians, do this thing on thesis 6, but thesis 10 is where it's at.
Interesting. We'll have to have you engage with Todd on that tomorrow. And I want to apologize for not getting to any questions today. I know there's been many unanswered questions. Please accept my apology. This has been kind of a lot to manage, the profound level of people participating in the event today. Also, I'm going to try to fix the chat tonight. Hopefully that works. There's been some frustrations about that. Again, my apologies. Jamie Katz says, from my talk to Gabriel's talk to Matthew's talk, is there a is there a late Žižek? Are we talking about a late Žižek, Matthew? Is this a kind of way of thinking about Slavoj as like
I mean, I don't know what late means anymore, late capitalism, late Žižek, late Marx, but I definitely think there, as you've identified too, Daniel, and others have identified, I think that there are important splits in Slavoj's writing. I mean, when Gabriel was here and Gabriel was talking, and I can't remember if it came up at all when in Kiara's or in your own talk, but there's an interesting moment of Žižek's writing in the 90s that I don't think gets historicized enough in the context of post-Yugoslavia and the politics of post-Yugoslavia and the role that the nationalist turn in Slovenia from the former Lacanian left in Yugoslavia turned alt-uber nationalist, and I've kept wondering, and I've asked Slavoj this as well without a good answer yet, if that has had any impact on his movement away from Laclau and radical democracy and more towards Badiou and Lenin and communism in the post-millennium period. And I think that even some of the frustrations felt in the post-Occupy Wall Street or whatever that period I think there's useful ways to periodize his work. I mean, where we talk, I don't know if the term late is something that we want to throw around.
Anytime you talk to a Lacanian, they're going to refute the framework of stages. Stages is a tough notion for any Lacanian to kind of accept, whether in whatever domain you're talking about it. There's that question. I feel also that we're not quite, the dust hasn't settled on the kind of political, genealogy of Žižek's various, the wide breadth of his political interventions. It's maybe too early to tell.
One thing I once heard somebody say, Sebastian Budgen said this about Slavoj, is that one of his great strengths is being able to read the conjuncture. And I know that one of people's constant frustrations with Slavoj's work is that he seems to move around on his political polemics. That is, politics are constantly shifting. But I don't think that we have to find that as a failing in his own work. I think that what he's doing is merely reading the variations in different historical moments, right? So we can, if we turn it back around and say that his different or maybe even frustrating positions on different issues, I think are more a reflection of the kinds of problems and contradictions that we see within our culture and our politics, more so than something about whether or not he's betraying himself. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It's what I call his pragmatism, but he would hate that word, I'm sure. But anyways, I think we're good. Duane, did you want to say any final comments?
I'll leave it to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Graham, I'm sorry that we had the snafu. We're excited to start off with your talk tomorrow on Žižek's transcendentalism, or Žižek and the transcendental.
It was my fault. I misread the time zones involved.
Are you in Cairo?
No, I'm in Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. That's right. You're based in Los Angeles, sir.
Yep.
Okay. All right, everyone. this has been a tour de force, a great first day. I want to thank all the speakers. Thanks to Mark and Wanyoung. Thanks to Dwayne for birthing this idea in the first place. Thanks to Gabriel, Matthew, everyone that presented did a stellar job. It's a great start. So we'll see you tomorrow at the same time. If you registered on Eventbrite, you should have the link there. If not, I'll send out like a reminder from Zoom, and you'll just get like a reminder from Zoom with the proper link to join. So with that, be well. Thank you all. We'll close for now. Peace out.